Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you and the day finally releases its hold on your shoulders, I want to share with you 12 ancient treasures, stories that have been whispered from teacher to student across countless generations, each one holding a key to the peace you seek, a doorway that opens not through force, but through the softest touch of understanding. Let yourself settle deeply now, for we have time, all the time consciousness needs to remember what it has always known. Our first journey takes us to a mountain monastery in old Japan, where the morning mist clings to pine branches like silk scarves forgotten by the night. Here, a young monk named Kenji begins each day before dawn, walking down the steep mountain path to the river below. His footsteps, the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness. And each morning, he does something that has become his practice, his discipline, his burden. He gathers stones, not small pebbles that rest light in the palm, but heavy river stones, each one worn smooth by centuries of water, each one weighing as much as a sleeping cat. He places them carefully in a canvas sack, feeling the weight settle against his back, and then he begins the long climb back up the mountain. His legs burn with the effort. His breath comes hard and sharp in the cold air. Sweat dampens his robes even in winter's grip. But Kenji believes this is the way that suffering builds character, that hardship forges enlightenment, that the path to peace must be paved with pain. Each day, more stones. Each week, a heavier load. The other monks notice his dedication, though they say nothing. They see him struggle past the meditation hall, past the vegetable gardens, all the way to the top of the mountain where he keeps his growing collection. Hundreds of stones now, piled like a cairn to his own determination, a monument to the weight he believes he must carry. His master, old Roshi Takuan, watches from the wooden porch of the temple. The master is ancient, his face a map of smile lines and weather, his eyes still bright as river stones themselves. He watches Kenji morning after morning, month after month, saying nothing. This is the way of Zen masters. They do not rush to correct, do not hurry to teach. They wait for the moment when the student's own understanding is ready to bloom, the way a flower bud knows precisely when to open. One spring morning, after Kenji has been carrying stones for nearly a year, Roshi Takuan rises early and positions himself on the path. The cherry blossoms are just beginning to fall, petals drifting down like snow made of light. The air smells of wet earth and new growth. Everything is beginning, everything is fresh, everything is being born except for Kenji, who carries the weight of all those yesterdays on his back. The young monk rounds the bend, his sack heavy with the day's collection, his face set in that expression of noble suffering he has perfected. He sees his master standing in the path and stops, bowing deeply despite the burden that makes the gesture awkward. Kenji, the master says, his voice soft as the morning breeze, I have watched you carry these stones for many months now. Yes, master, Kenji replies, straightening with effort. I carry them to build strength, to cultivate discipline, to walk the path of hardship that leads to enlightenment. The master nods slowly, as if considering this. A cherry blossom lands on his shoulder and rests there like a small pink hand. And tell me, he asks, did the Buddha instruct us to carry heavy stones up mountains? Kenji pauses, uncertain. He has read the sutras, studied the teachings, memorized countless passages. The Buddha taught that life is suffering, master. I thought, the Buddha taught that there is suffering, the old master interrupts gently. But he also taught the end of suffering. Tell me, when you reach the top of the mountain with your stones, what do you do with them? I place them in a pile, master. And then I rest before the evening meditation. And the next morning, I gather more stones. The master's eyes crinkle with something that might be sadness or might be compassion. Perhaps they are the same thing. Come, he says, gesturing for Kenji to follow him off the path to a small clearing where the morning sun breaks through the pine branches in golden shafts. Set down your burden, the master instructs. Kenji lowers the heavy sack, and his shoulders rise immediately, as if they had been waiting years for this permission. The relief is so sudden it almost makes him gasp. Now, says Roshi Takuan, settling himself on a flat rock, Tell me what you are carrying." Kenji looks at the sack, confused. "Stones, master. River stones. Are you certain?" The young monk opens the sack, shows the stones inside. "Yes, master. See, stones." The old master smiles, that smile that has comforted 10,000 questions. "My dear student, I see stones, yes, but I wonder what else you carry. Tell me, when you walk up this mountain each day, what thoughts accompany you?" And here, finally, Kenji begins to understand. Because as he thinks about his daily climb, he realizes what he actually carries. He carries the thought that he is not good enough yet. He carries the belief that peace must be earned through punishment. He carries his teacher's expectation, or what he imagines to be his teacher's expectation. He carries his own disappointment in himself, his comparing mind that measures his progress against other monks, his fear that he will never achieve enlightenment, his pride in being the one who suffers most visibly. The words spill out, unexpected as spring rain. I carry the fear that I am not dedicated enough, the worry that I will fail, the belief that I must prove myself worthy, the comparison to others who seem to meditate more deeply, more easily, the shame of my wandering mind, the pride in my discipline, the anger at myself for having pride, the enough, the master says, but his voice is honey warm without sharpness. You see now? The stones in your sack are heavy, yes, but they are nothing compared to what you carry in your mind. The stones you can put down at any moment. But these other burdens, these you have been carrying up the mountain and down again, up and down, for lifetimes perhaps. A cherry blossom petal lands on Kenji's hand, so light he barely feels it. There is a teaching, the master continues, from the great master Linji. He said, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha." Do you understand what this means? Kenji shakes his head. It means that even the Buddha can become another burden if you make him into something you must attain, something separate from yourself. Even enlightenment becomes another stone to carry, if you believe it is somewhere else, somewhere ahead, somewhere you are not. The master reaches into the sack and pulls out a single stone, holding it up to the morning light. This stone is just a stone. It does not care that you carry it. It does not ask to be carried. You chose to pick it up, believing that carrying it would make you stronger, wiser, more pure. But I tell you, the Buddha himself said, you only lose what you cling to. You have been clinging to suffering itself, making it sacred, making it necessary. Kenji feels something crack open in his chest, like ice breaking on a spring river. Tears come, unexpected and clean. Master, I thought the path required this. I thought I had to earn peace through pain. And now? The old master asks. Now I see that I have been creating my own suffering, calling it practice. Roshi Takun nods, satisfied. The path is not about adding more burdens, more rules, more suffering. It is about recognizing what you carry unnecessarily and having the courage to set it down, not to throw it away with force or anger, but to simply release it. Let it return to the earth that made it. The master stands, his old bones creaking like the pine branches above. Come, let us return these stones to the river together. And so they do. Teacher and student walk down the mountain path in the growing light, the sack between them. When they reach the river, that same river where Kenji has gathered his daily burden for so many months, the master shows him how to release each stone back to the current. Not with drama, not with ceremony, but with simple acknowledgement. This is a stone, I carried it, now I return it. Plop. One stone sinks into the clear water, settling among its brothers. Plop. Another finds its way home. Plop, plop, plop. With each stone released, Kenji feels lighter. Not just his body, but something deeper. Something that has been clenched tight since childhood, since he first learned to judge himself, to measure himself, to carry the weight of who he thought he should be. When the last stone is returned, they stand together by the water. A kingfisher darts by in a flash of blue. The river continues its eternal song, the same song it has sung for 10,000 years, the same song it will sing for 10,000 more. Master, Kenji asks, what should I do tomorrow morning? The old teacher laughs, a sound like water over stones. Do you need to do anything? I don't know. Good. Not knowing is good. Not knowing leaves room for the morning to teach you what it wants to teach. Perhaps you will sit in meditation. Perhaps you will tend the garden. Perhaps you will walk by this river and simply listen. But whatever you do it without the stones, neither the ones in your sack nor the ones in your mind. They walk back up the mountain together, slowly, in no hurry. The path is the same path Kenji has climbed every day for months, but now it feels different. Lighter, wider, more forgiving. He notices things he never saw before, the way the moss grows only on the north side of the trees, the pattern of deer tracks in the soft earth, the particular quality of morning light through pine needles. At the top, where his pile of stones once stood, there is only empty space. Tomorrow, Kenji knows, grass will begin to grow there. Maybe wildflowers, maybe nothing at all, and that will be perfect. That night, during evening meditation, Kenji sits with the other monks in the silent hall. His mind still wanders. Minds do that, they are like water, always moving. But now, when he notices his thoughts carrying him away, he remembers the sound of stones sinking into the river. Plop. He lets the thought go. Plop. Another thought released. Plop. The worry about whether he is meditating correctly returned to the waters of awareness. And in the releasing, in the letting go, he touches something he's been seeking all along, not through carrying burdens up mountains, but through finally setting them down. The peace that was always here, patient as river stones, waiting beneath the weight of all he thought he had to bear. The sound of those stones falling echoes still, if you listen, and brings to mind another teacher, in another place, who understood the weight we carry in different ways. Let me tell you about a tea master who received a very unusual visitor one autumn afternoon, a visitor whose cup was already quite full. As the tea spilled over that cup's rim, I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a small tea house nestled in the mountains of old Japan, where the autumn maples were turning the hillsides into living flame, and a renowned scholar was about to learn the hardest lesson of his distinguished life. Professor Hayashi was a man of considerable reputation. He had studied at the greatest universities, earned degrees in philosophy and religion, written 7 books on Buddhist thought, and lectured at temples across the country. His mind was a vast library of concepts, theories, and interpretations. He could quote sutras in 3 languages, debate the finest points of doctrine, and explain the meaning of enlightenment with remarkable precision. Everyone agreed, if anyone understood Buddhism intellectually, it was Professor Hayashi. But understanding and knowing, as you may have discovered yourself, are not always the same thing. The professor had heard rumors of a tea master living in humble circumstances in these mountains, a man named Nan, in whom some whispered possessed genuine wisdom. The professor was skeptical. He had met many so-called masters who turned out to be simple men with simple platitudes, but he was also thorough in his research. If this Nanin had insights worth recording, the professor would add them to his next book. If not, well, at least he could say he had investigated personally. So on a crisp autumn morning, the professor made the journey. He wore his finest robes, carried his leather satchel full of notebooks and his own published works, and climbed the narrow path to the tea master's modest dwelling. The house was small, almost austere, with a garden of raked gravel and a few carefully placed stones. A single chrysanthemum bloomed in a cracked pot by the door. The professor knocked, and the door opened to reveal an elderly man with a gentle face and simple clothes. This was Nanin, though he introduced himself with such humility that the professor almost missed the introduction, his mind already composing how he would describe this meeting in his journal. "Please come in," Nanin said, gesturing to the tea room. "You have travelled far. Let me prepare tea." The professor entered, noting everything with his analytical eye. The worn tatami mats, the single scroll hanging in the alcove with calligraphy he recognized as rather ordinary, the plain ceramic tea set. Nothing impressive, nothing that suggested great wisdom. He felt his skepticism confirmed. They settled across from each other, the professor sitting with the straightness of a man accustomed to lecture halls, the tea master moving with the fluid ease of water finding its course. Nan began the ritual of preparing tea, heating the water, warming the pot, measuring the leaves with careful attention. The professor watched with barely concealed impatience. He had not travelled all this way to watch an old man make tea. "Master Nan, the professor began, unable to wait any longer, "I have come to learn about Zen. I have studied extensively, of course. My latest book examines the intersection of Rinzai and Soto schools, and I've just finished a paper comparing Dogen's philosophy with Western phenomenology. But I thought it would be valuable to hear from a practitioner to add some authentic voice to my theoretical framework." Nan nodded, saying nothing, continuing to prepare the tea. The water began to simmer, making that sound the Japanese call the wind in the pines. The professor continued, "You see, I've been exploring the concept of mu-shin, the no-mind state. My interpretation is that it represents a cognitive suspension of dualistic thinking, a phenomenological bracketing similar to what Husserl described, though of course achieved through meditation rather than philosophical method. Would you agree with that analysis?" "Perhaps," Nan said softly, "you would like some tea?" Yes, of course," the professor said, slightly annoyed at the interruption to his explanation. "As I was saying, the documentation suggests that historical Zen masters used koans as a form of cognitive disruption, breaking down logical structures to create space for non-conceptual awareness. I've catalogued over 300 koans and identified 17 distinct categories based on their pedagogical approach." Nan lifted the teapot and began to pour tea into the professor's cup. The golden green liquid flowed in a steady stream, steam rising with the scent of late summer grass and mountain air. The professor barely noticed, warming to his subject. "Now, regarding the transmission outside scripture that Bodhidharma spoke of, I believe this refers to the ineffability of certain states of consciousness that resist linguistic representation, though interestingly, we can still construct metalinguistic frameworks to discuss this very ineffability, which creates a productive paradox that..." The tea reached the rim of the cup. The professor was still talking. "And this paradox itself becomes a teaching tool, you see, because in acknowledging what cannot be said, we paradoxically say something about it, which Nagarjuna explored in his concept of emptiness, though of course his approach differs from." The tea spilled over the rim, the later Chan development of sudden enlightenment versus gradual cultivation, and I argue in Chapter 4 that both approaches have validity depending on the practitioner's karmic conditioning, and the tea was flowing over the cup's edge, spreading across the small table, dripping onto the tatami. Mat. Psychological predisposition, though the research on this is admittedly limited because we lack proper empirical measurements for "Professor," Nan said quietly, still pouring, "contemplative states, which is why I propose a new methodological framework that combines traditional texts with modern cognitive science to..." "Professor," Nan repeated, a bit louder. Finally, the professor noticed. His eyes widened as he watched the tea cascading over his cup, pooling on the table, staining the mat. "Stop, the cup is full. No more will go in." Nan set down the teapot and smiled a smile of such warmth and gentleness that it softened the entire room. "Like this cup," he said. "You are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The words hung in the air like the steam from the spilled tea. The professor opened his mouth, then closed it. For perhaps the first time in 20 years of academic discourse, he had nothing to say. He looked down at his overfull cup, at the wasted tea spreading across the table, and something in him cracked, not broke, but cracked, like ice beginning to thaw, like a seed splitting open to let the green shoot through. All his knowledge, all his theories, all his carefully constructed understanding it, was all there in that overfull cup, so packed with what he already knew that nothing new could enter. He had travelled to this mountain not to learn, but to confirm, not to receive but to display, not to empty himself, but to fill yet another notebook with yet another master's words that he would analyze and categorize and explain. He began, then stopped. What could he say? That he understood, but that would just be more fullness, more claiming of knowledge. That he didn't understand? But that felt like a strategic humility, another form of the same game. So instead, he simply sat. And in the sitting, in the silence that opened up when his talking stopped, he began to hear things he had not heard before, the sound of the water still simmering in the pot, the whisper of wind through the pine trees outside, the settling of the house around them, his own breath moving in and out, his lungs. Nan rose and returned with a cloth, wiping up the spilled tea with care, not hurried, not irritated, simply attending to what was there to be attended to. He cleaned the table, the professor's cup, even the small stain on the mat, making everything fresh again. Then he poured a new cup of tea, this time filling it only 3/4 full, leaving space at the top, space for the tea to breathe, space for the aroma to rise, space for something new to enter. "Please," he said, offering the cup to the professor. "Drink." The professor took the cup with both hands, feeling its warmth, smelling the delicate fragrance. He sipped, and for the first time in years, he actually tasted tea. Not the idea of tea, not the cultural significance of tea ceremony, not the philosophical implications of presence in the act of drinking, but simply tea. Slightly bitter, slightly sweet, warm, alive, real. The Buddha taught, Nanin said softly, that the mind is everything. What you think, you become. You have thought so many thoughts, Professor, that you have become a library of thoughts. But perhaps you have forgotten to become a human being who tastes tea. The professor felt tears prickling at his eyes. How long had it been since he had truly tasted anything? How many sunsets had he missed while reading about the impermanence of all things? How many moments of simple peace had passed him by while he studied the nature of peace? "Master," he said, and his voice was different now, smaller, more genuine. "I think I have been a fool." "No," Nanin replied. "You have been a scholar. There is great value in scholarship. Your books may help many people understand the concepts of Zen, but concepts are like maps, and maps are very useful things. They can show you where a mountain is, what paths lead there, how high the peak rises. But no map, however detailed, can give you the feeling of standing on that peak with the wind in your face and the vast sky opening above you. For that, you must put down the map and walk." The professor nodded slowly. "How do I empty my cup?" "You are emptying it now," Nanin said. "Simply by asking, simply by listening, simply by being willing to not know. The emptying is not a violent thing, not a rejection of all you have learned. It is simply making space. Your knowledge can remain. It may serve you and others, but hold it lightly, like you hold that teacup. Firmly enough that you don't drop it, gently enough that you don't crack it, openly enough that you can set it down when something else asks for your hands." They sat together in silence then, drinking tea, watching the afternoon light shift across the garden. The professor noticed how the light caught the edges of the raked gravel, creating tiny shadows that changed moment by moment. He had never noticed such things before. He had been too busy knowing about light and shadow to see them. When the tea was finished, the professor bowed deeply. "Thank you, Master. I think I will stay in the area for a few days, if I may. Not to interview you or gather material for my next book. Just to be here." Nanin smiled. "There is a small inn down the mountain. The owner is kind. Tell him I sent you. And perhaps tomorrow you could come back, not for teaching, just for tea." "Just for tea," the professor repeated, and the phrase felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a door he had not known was closed. As he walked down the mountain path that evening, his leather satchel felt heavier than it had on the climb up. All those books, all those notebooks, all that accumulated knowledge, he would not throw them away. They were part of his path, part of his life. But he understood now that they were not the path itself. Just as the cup is not the tea, just as the words pointing at the moon are not the moon itself. He set his satchel down by the side of the path and sat on a smooth stone, looking out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The professor watched without naming the colors, without analyzing the atmospheric conditions that created such beauty, without comparing this sunset to other sunsets he had seen. He simply watched, his cup finally empty enough to be filled with the simple, undeniable presence of this moment, exactly as it was. And in that emptying, in that space where his knowing used to be, something else flowed in. Not knowledge but understanding, not concepts but direct experience, not the map but the territory itself, vast and immediate and real. As the tea spilled over that cup's rim, something else was beginning to flow, an understanding that would find its way to a garden where nothing seemed to grow, where a keeper was about to discover that everything he thought was worthless held treasures he had never imagined. That garden taught its keeper to look closely, but let me take you there first, to the monastery where Brother Ichiro had served for 15 years, tending the paths and gardens with a dedication that bordered on obsession. This was not one of the grand monasteries with sweeping landscapes and perfectly manicured trees shaped like clouds. This was a modest place, humble in its means, where the monks grew their own vegetables and swept their own floors and lived simply as the Buddha had taught. Brother Ichiro's responsibility was the meditation garden and the walking paths that wound between the various buildings of the monastery. It was a task he had accepted with joy at first, seeing it as a meditation in itself, a way to serve while cultivating mindfulness. And for many years, it had been exactly that. He would rise before dawn and walk the paths with his tools, removing any debris, raking the gravel into peaceful patterns, ensuring that when the other monks emerged for morning meditation, they would find everything serene and orderly. But lately, the joy had turned to frustration, and the frustration had deepened into something close to despair. The problem was weeds. No matter how diligently he worked, no matter how early he rose, or how carefully he tended the paths, the weeds kept coming. They pushed up between the carefully placed stones. They invaded the raked gravel. They sprouted in the meditation garden where only intentional plantings should grow. And the more he pulled them, the more they seemed to return, as if mocking his efforts, as if laughing at his dedication. There were broad-leafed weeds that spread across the ground in defiant mats. There were tall weeds with stubborn taproots that broke when he tried to pull them, leaving pieces behind that would sprout again within days. There were delicate-looking weeds that seemed fragile, but grew in such profusion that he could spend an entire morning removing them from one path, only to find them returned by the following week. There were weeds with tiny purple flowers that would have been beautiful anywhere else but were here, just evidence of his failure. Brother Ichiro had tried everything. He had pulled them by hand until his fingers bled. He had dug them out with tools, going deep to get the roots. He had, even though he felt ashamed of this, poured boiling water on some of the worst patches, hoping to kill them at their source. Nothing worked. The weeds were winning, and in his mind, their victory was his defeat. He began to avoid the other monks, certain they were judging him. When the abbot walked the meditation path, Ichiro was sure he noticed every dandelion, every blade of invasive grass. When visitors came to the monastery, he imagined them wondering why such a holy place had such poorly maintained gardens. His meditation practice suffered. His sleep grew restless. The simple task that had once brought him peace now brought only anxiety and shame. One autumn morning, as he knelt in the gravel pulling yet another generation of weeds, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw a monk. He did not recognize an old man with a deeply weathered face and bright, curious eyes, wearing the simple robes of a wandering teacher. Visitors were not uncommon at the monastery, but something about this man made Ichiro pause. "Good morning, brother," the old monk said, his voice warm and unhurried. "I am Master Soyen, just passing through. Your abbot has kindly offered me tea and a place to rest." Ichiro bowed, feeling self-conscious about the weedy patch he was kneeling in, about his dirt-stained robes, about the general chaos of growth that surrounded him despite his best efforts. "I hope you will forgive the state of our gardens," Ichiro said, gesturing around him with a defeated sweep of his hand. I try to maintain them properly, but these weeds, they are relentless. They ruin everything. They make the whole monastery look neglected. To his surprise, Master Soyen smiled, not a polite smile, but one of genuine delight. "May I join you?" he asked, and without waiting for an answer, he lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the path, right in the middle of what Ichiro considered his greatest failure. The old master looked around with evident pleasure, his eyes moving slowly across the garden, taking in everything: the intentional plantings and the uninvited ones, the raked gravel and the disrupting weeds, the carefully placed stones and the wild volunteers growing between them. "Tell me," he said, picking up one of the weeds Ichiro had just pulled and examining it with interest. "What is this plant called?" "I don't know its name," Ichiro admitted. "It's just a weed. Worthless. It grows everywhere, choking out the intentional plants." "Ah," said Master Soyen. "You don't know its name, but you know it's worthless. Interesting." He turned the plant in his fingers, looking at its leaves, its root structure, the small white flowers that Ichiro had never really noticed before. "This is shepherd's purse, a plant that has traveled with humans for thousands of years. In early spring, before your intentional vegetables have even sprouted, this worthless plant provides tender leaves that can be eaten in salad or cooked like spinach. It is full of vitamins. In traditional medicine, it is used to stop bleeding and reduce inflammation. The seeds, when dried, have a pleasant peppery taste and can be used like mustard." Ichiro stared at the plant with new eyes. I didn't know." "And this one?" Master Soyen reached for another weed, one with a thick taproot that Ichiro particularly hated. "Do you know this one?" "Another weed, very difficult to remove. The root goes deep." "This is burdock," the master said. "Yes, the root goes deep, sometimes as deep as a man's arm is long. Do you know why? Because it is storing medicine, storing food. This root, when harvested at the right time, can be cooked and eaten. It supports the liver, purifies the blood, and has been used as medicine for countless generations. In a few weeks, this plant will send up a tall stalk with purple flowers. The bees love it. And the seeds, those burrs that stick to clothing, do you know they inspired the invention of fasteners that your modern world uses every day?" Ichiro felt something shifting in his chest, like a door he hadn't known was locked beginning to open. Master Soyen continued, moving through the garden, pointing out one weed after another. The dandelion whose leaves could be eaten, whose roots made healing tea, whose flowers became wine, and whose seeds fed the birds. The plantain that grew in the compacted soil of the walking paths, and whose leaves could be applied to insect bites and minor wounds. The chickweed that blanketed the ground in dense mats and could be harvested as a nutritious green vegetable. The clover that fed the bees and fixed nitrogen in the soil, making it richer for other plants. "Every plant you have been calling worthless," the old master said gently, "has worth beyond measure. Every plant you have been fighting has been trying to help. They grow in poor soil and make it rich. They provide food when cultivated plants would fail. They offer medicine freely to anyone who knows how to look. They feed insects that feed birds. They break up compacted earth with their strong roots. They are not invading your garden, brother. They are healing it." Ichiro felt tears on his face, though he could not have said exactly why he was crying. Shame, perhaps, at his ignorance, relief at being released from a battle he could never win, wonder at discovering value in what he had despised, gratitude for this teacher who had appeared seemingly from nowhere to show him how to see. "But master," he said, wiping his eyes, "the garden is supposed to be orderly, intentional, a place of peace and meditation. These plants grow wild wherever they want. They disrupt the patterns I create." Master Soyen nodded, understanding. "Tell me, brother Ichiro, when you meditate, do unwanted thoughts ever arise?" "Of course, constantly." "And do you spend your meditation time fighting these thoughts, trying to force your mind into perfect, weed-free emptiness?" Ichiro paused. "I used to, but my teacher instructed me to simply notice the thoughts, acknowledge them, and let them pass. Fighting them only makes them stronger." And has your teacher ever suggested, the master continued, that these unwanted thoughts might actually be showing you something? That anxiety might be pointing to something that needs attention, that a memory might be revealing something unresolved, that even difficult thoughts have their purpose in the ecology of your mind. The parallel was so clear that Ichiro almost laughed. I have been trying to create a perfect garden, the way I used to try to create a perfect mind, fighting what arises naturally, calling it wrong, calling it worthless, exhausting myself in the battle. And what did the Buddha teach about the nature of all things? Master Soyen asked. Ichiro knew this teaching by heart. He had chanted it 1,000 times. All conditioned things are impermanent. All things are without inherent self-nature. All beings have Buddha nature. Even the weeds, the master asked with a twinkle in his eye. Even the weeds, Ichiro whispered. Everything has Buddha nature. Everything arises from the same source. Everything is connected in the web of interdependent origination. The weeds are not separate from the garden. They are the garden, expressing itself in forms I had not planned, showing me opportunities I had not imagined. Master Soyen reached out and patted Ichiro's shoulder. The Buddha also taught, just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. What he meant was that we need the spark, the connection to what is real and true. You have been so focused on your idea of what the garden should be that you stopped seeing what the garden actually is. Your spiritual life was dying because you were living in the idea instead of the reality. They sat together in silence for a while, surrounded by the abundance of growth wanted and unwanted, planned and spontaneous, intentional and wild. A bee landed on a dandelion flower, gathering pollen. A small bird hopped along the path, pecking at seeds. The wind rustled through leaves, both cultivated and volunteer. So what should I do? Ichiro finally asked. Let everything grow wild, abandon my responsibilities. What do you think? Master Soyen asked back, in the way of Zen masters who know that the best answers come from within. Ichiro thought carefully. I think I should learn the names of these plants, learn what they offer, what they teach. I think I should tend the garden with awareness, not warfare. Perhaps some plants need to be removed from certain places, not because they are worthless, but because of where they are growing, because something else is better suited to that particular spot. But I should remove them with gratitude, not hatred. I should compost them, return them to the earth, let them nourish other growth. I should study them, understand them, maybe even cultivate some of them intentionally, in places where they can thrive and offer their gifts. And the meditation paths? The master prompted. Should they be kept clear for walking? Yes, Ichiro said, but not because growth is wrong. Because clear paths serve a purpose, they guide the monks, they create space for walking meditation. It is not about perfection or control. It is about appropriate relationship. The paths need to be paths. The garden can be more wild, and I can learn to see the beauty and value in both, in order and in wildness, in the intentional and the spontaneous. Master Soyen smiled broadly. You have found your way to wisdom, brother. Do you know what else you have found? Ichiro shook his head. Compassion. When you stop dividing the world into worthy and worthless, when you stop seeing things as enemies to be destroyed, when you begin to see the value in everything, even what you had rejected, this is the beginning of true compassion. And it starts in the garden, but it does not end there. How you see these weeds is how you will begin to see the difficult people in your life, the challenging emotions in your heart, the aspects of yourself you have been trying to uproot and destroy. The old master rose to his feet with surprising grace. I must continue my journey, but I wonder if I might take some of these weeds with me. I would like to dry some burdock root for tea, and I saw some chickweed that would make a fine addition to my evening meal. Of course, Master, Ichiro said, standing quickly. Take whatever you wish, and thank you. Thank you for teaching me to see. I taught you nothing, Master Soyen replied. I simply pointed. You did the seeing yourself. The garden was always teaching. You just needed to learn its language. After the old master left, walking down the mountain path with a small bundle of weeds, wrapped in cloth, Ichiro stood in the garden for a long time. He looked at it with new eyes. Not the eyes of a frustrated keeper trying to impose order on chaos, but the eyes of a student learning from a patient teacher. That afternoon, instead of pulling weeds, he fetched a notebook and began sketching the different plants, noting where each one grew, what conditions it preferred, what gifts it offered. He would still maintain the paths, still create spaces for quiet beauty, still serve his role as keeper. But now he would work with the garden rather than against it, learning from its wisdom rather than fighting its nature. And when he sat in meditation that evening, when the familiar swirl of thoughts arose, the worries and memories and plans and regrets, he did not fight them or call them worthless. Instead, he noticed them with the same new eyes he had brought to the garden. This anxiety, what gift might it bring? This memory, what is it trying to teach? This restless energy, what is it asking to be expressed? The weeds in his mind, like the weeds in his garden, were not enemies. They were teachers, healers, opportunities for understanding. They arose from the same ground as everything else, connected in the vast web of being, each one carrying Buddha nature in its particular form. And in seeing this, Brother Ichiro found the peace he had been seeking all along, not the peace of perfect control, but the peace of profound acceptance, the peace that comes from recognizing that everything, even what we call worthless, has worth beyond measure if we only know how to look. That golden light through the crack showed her what words often cannot, though let me tell you about what happened next. In a forest not far from that monastery, where a woodcutter was about to discover something that would change every moment that followed. In that moment of complete attention, time itself seemed to pause. But let me take you to the beginning of that day, to a small village at the edge of a great forest, where a woodcutter named Takumi was already awake in the pre-dawn darkness, his mind racing ahead to all the tasks that waited for him. Takumi was a good man, a hard worker, respected in his village for his reliability and strength. He had been cutting wood since he was a boy, learning at his father's side, and now, at 40 years old, he could fall a tree, split logs, and stack cordwood with practiced efficiency. His hands were calloused, his back was strong, and his reputation was solid. He provided for his family, fulfilled his obligations, and met every deadline. By all outward measures, he was successful. But inside, Takumi was never at peace. His mind was always somewhere else, racing ahead to the next tree, the next order to fill, the next problem to solve. When he split logs in the morning, his mind was already at the afternoon's delivery. When he delivered wood, his mind was calculating tomorrow's work. When he ate his evening meal, he was mentally reviewing what he had accomplished and what remained undone, feeling guilty if he had not done enough, anxious about what awaited him the next day. Even in his sleep, his dreams were filled with trees falling and logs splitting and customers waiting and tasks unfinished. He woke each morning, already tired, already behind, already chasing something he could never quite catch, the feeling of being done, of being enough, of being here. This particular autumn morning began like all the others. Takumi dressed quickly, barely tasting the rice and tea his wife prepared, his mind already in the forest counting trees. He gathered his tools, the sharp axe he had inherited from his father, the wedges, the ropes, checking them with hands that knew every nick and grain, but eyes that did not really see. "Be safe," his wife said as he left, and he nodded without really hearing, already gone in his mind to the stand of cedar he planned to work that day. The walk to the forest took half an hour, but Takumi never experienced it. His feet knew the way, so his mind was free to wander, worrying about the weather, calculating board feet, rehearsing a conversation he needed to have with a difficult customer, replaying a conversation from yesterday that he thought he had handled poorly, planning, always planning. He did not notice the persimmons hanging orange and heavy in the trees he passed. He did not hear the geese calling overhead, flying south in their perfect formation. He did not feel the particular quality of the autumn air, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of turning leaves and distant wood smoke. He was walking through the world, but not in it, his body present, but his attention scattered across past and future, regret and anticipation, everywhere but here. When he reached the forest, he approached the first cedar he had marked days before. A tall, straight tree, perfect for the temple order he needed to fill. He set down his tools, but before he even positioned himself for the first swing, his mind was already moving ahead. After this tree, he would need to fall 2 more. Then he would need to limb them, then buck them into lengths, then split the pieces, then stack them for drying, then deliver the order next week, then collect payment, then use that payment to buy rice and the first swing of his axe bit into the wood, then the second, then the third. His body knew the rhythm, the angle, the force needed. Swing after swing, the axe rose and fell, and chips flew, but Takumi was not there. His hands held the axe, his muscles powered the swing, his eyes judged the cut, but his mind was elsewhere, already splitting logs that had not yet been cut from trees that had not yet fallen. He worked this way all morning, efficient and absent, productive and miserable. 2 trees fell. Then he began the work of limbing, cutting away the branches to leave clean trunks. Again, his hands knew what to do. Again, his mind wandered. He worried that he had not cut enough. He worried that he had cut too much. He compared himself to other woodcutters who seemed to work faster. He remembered his father telling him he was too slow. He resented a neighbor who owed him money. He felt guilty for resenting. Around and around his thoughts went, like a dog chasing its tail, getting nowhere but growing more tired with each circle. By midday, his back ached from tension, not from work. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders were tight. He had been working for hours, but felt as though he had accomplished nothing. Because his attention had been so divided that nothing felt real, nothing felt complete, nothing felt satisfying. He stopped for the meal his wife had packed rice balls with pickled plum and ate mechanically, tasting nothing. His eyes already on the next tree he needed to fall. Just one more, he thought. Just one more tree, and then I will have done enough for today. But he knew it was a lie. There would always be one more tree, one more task, one more thing between him and the peace he sought but never found. As he rose to return to work, something happened. A single leaf, brilliant red, detached from a maple branch high above and began to fall. It drifted down through the air, spinning slowly, catching the afternoon light, descending through the cathedral of tree trunks in absolute silence. Some instinct made Takumi pause and watch it. His hand was on his axe. His mind was already moving toward the next tree, but something in the leaf's descent arrested him. It fell so slowly, so completely, so perfectly present to its falling. It did not hurry. It did not worry about where it would land. It did not think about the leaves that had fallen before it, or the leaves still waiting to fall. It simply fell, wholly and completely, doing the one thing it was doing. And in that moment, watching that leaf, Takumi suddenly arrived. He did not know how it happened or why. 1 second he was lost in the fog of his scattered thoughts, and the next he was here fully, completely, undeniably here. He felt his feet on the forest floor, felt the particular texture of the ground beneath his boots, felt the weight of his body, the movement of his breath, the air on his face. He heard the forest, really heard it. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the creak of branches, the distant call of a crow, the profound silence underneath all sound. He looked at the axe in his hand and saw it, truly saw it, for perhaps the first time in years. The worn wooden handle, smooth from decades of use, from his father's hands and his father's father's hands and now his own. The grain of the wood, dark and light in swirling patterns. The weight of the metal head, the geometry of its edge, the way it caught the light. He looked at the tree before him, the one he was about to cut, and something in him stopped. Not stopped working, but stopped rushing, stopped dividing his attention, stopped being everywhere else. He looked at the tree, really looked at it, and saw a living being that had been growing for perhaps 100 years, drawing water from deep in the earth, reaching for the sun, breathing out the oxygen he breathed in, connected to everything around it through roots and fungi and the vast underground. D. Network of the forest. The great teacher Dogen had written, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." Takumi had heard these words chanted in the temple, but he had never understood them. Now, standing before this tree, fully present for the first time in years, he glimpsed what they meant. In this moment of complete attention, he had forgotten himself, forgotten his worries, his plans, his comparing mind, his racing thoughts. And in forgetting himself, he had found himself, found his life, found the present moment that is the only moment we ever truly have. He set down his axe, not because he would not cut the tree, he would, because this was his work, his way of serving, his responsibility, but not yet. First, he would be here, completely here. He would meet this tree, this moment, this breath, with the full attention it deserved. He placed his hand on the tree's bark, feeling its roughness, its solidity, its aliveness. He stood quietly, breathing, feeling the tree's presence and his own presence, and the way they were both part of this larger presence, this vast, alive now that contains everything. "Thank you," he whispered to the tree. "I see you. I'm here with you." The Buddha had taught, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." How many times had Takumi heard these words? But hearing words and living them are different things. Now, for the first time, he was not dwelling in the past or dreaming of the future. He was here, and here was enough. Here was everything. When he finally picked up his axe again, everything was different. He positioned himself with care, feeling his feet find their proper stance, feeling his hands grip the handle with just the right firmness, not tense, not loose, but alive and responsive. He looked at exactly where he wanted the blade to bite, visualizing the cut, understanding the grain of the wood, respecting the tree even as he prepared to fall it. He drew a breath, and in that breath was the whole world, the forest breathing with him, the trees exhaling oxygen as he inhaled it, the vast exchange that had been happening all along, but which he had never noticed because he had never been present enough to notice. The axe rose, not while his mind was planning the next swing, but completely, wholly, the swing rising. The axe fell, not while worrying if the cut was good enough, but simply falling, his whole attention on this single movement, this meeting of blade and wood, this present action. The blade bit into the tree, and he felt it, truly felt it. The resistance of the wood, the shock traveling up the handle into his hands, into his arms, into his body. He was not separate from the cutting. He was the cutting, was the tree, was the forest, was the moment itself, undivided. Swing after swing, completely present, not thinking about the swing that had passed or the swing that would come, but only this swing, this breath, this moment. His mind was not silent. Thoughts still arose, but they passed like clouds across a clear sky, and he remained here, anchored in the present, in the sensation of work, in the reality of now. The tree began to lean. He felt it, that moment when its balance shifted, when gravity took over, when the work of his axe had done enough, and the tree began its fall. He stepped back, watching it descend, not with half his attention while the other half raced ahead to the next task, but with complete presence, honoring this tree's fall, this ending that would become someone's temple beam, someone's warmth, someone's shelter. The tree hit the ground with a sound like thunder, and birds exploded from nearby branches, and the forest seemed to pause and take a breath, and Takumi stood in that breath, in that pause, completely there. The work continued, but it was different now. Limbing the branches, he felt the axe cutting, felt the branches falling away, felt the trunk emerging clean and ready. Bucking the trunk into lengths, he saw the saw cutting, felt the rhythm of pulling and pushing, heard the sound of the blade through wood. Splitting the pieces, he felt the wedge entering the wood, felt the moment when the grain gave way and the log separated, falling in two pieces that had been one piece, showing their inner rings, their history written in wood. Everything was the same. Everything was completely different. The work was still hard. His muscles still ached. His back still grew tired. But the suffering was gone, that mental anguish that had always accompanied his work, that sense of inadequacy and incompletion and always being behind. Because he was no longer behind, he was here. And here, there was only what was happening. And what was happening was enough, because it was what was real. The afternoon light slanted golden through the trees. Takumi noticed it, the particular quality of autumn light, the way it made everything look amber and ancient. He saw spider webs strung between branches, catching the light like strings of jewels. He heard a woodpecker somewhere in the canopy, its rhythmic knocking like a heartbeat. He was part of it all, not separate, not in his head, but here, embodied, alive. When the day's work was done, not because he had fallen enough trees or cut enough wood, but simply because the sun was setting and it was time to go home, he gathered his tools with the same complete attention he had brought to the work. He cleaned the sap from his axe blade, felt the weight of his tools on his shoulder, began the walk home. And now the walk was not empty time to be filled with worrying. It was walking. He felt his legs carrying him, felt his feet touching the earth with each step, felt the cool evening air on his face. He saw the persimmons he had missed that morning, glowing like small lanterns in the dusk. He heard the geese he had not noticed, settling into the rice fields for the night. He smelled wood smoke from the village, and the scent brought him fully into the moment of returning home, to his wife, to his meal, to the evening ahead. When he arrived home and his wife greeted him, he really saw her, saw the concern in her eyes that he usually missed, saw the grey in her hair that he had not noticed appearing, saw the person he loved, but so rarely met with full attention because he was always somewhere else. "How was your day?" she asked. And he paused before answering, really considering the question. How was his day? It had been the same work he did every day, but it had also been completely new, completely different, because he had finally been there for it. "I was present," he said. "For the first time in years, I was actually present." She looked at him curiously, and he smiled, unable to fully explain what had happened in that moment when a falling leaf had awakened him from the dream of past and future into the reality of now. That night he slept deeply, and his dreams were not of tasks undone, but of trees growing and leaves falling and axes swinging, and all of it happening in an eternal present, moment after moment of this precious, irreplaceable life. In that moment of complete attention, time itself seemed to pause, much like it did for a ferryman on a wide river, whose oars had rowed 10,000 crossings, yet who was about to discover that even 10,000 crossings had not taught him everything about the nature of peace. The ferryman understood what the merchant had yet to learn, that some waters we must cross alone. But let me take you to the river first, to the wide, slow-moving water that separated two provinces, and to the small wooden ferry that had carried travellers across it for more years than anyone could rem, Amber. The ferryman's name was Kenshin, and he had been rowing this crossing since he was a young man learning the trade from his father. Now his hair was silver, his hands were gnarled like old tree roots, and his face was weathered by sun and wind and countless days on the water. He knew every current of this river, every shift in its mood with the seasons, every trick of the weather that could make an easy crossing, dangerous or a difficult one, smooth. But more than knowing the river, Kenshin had learned something else over his decades of ferrying. He had learned how to carry people across the water without carrying their troubles into his own heart. He had learned, though he might not have said it this way, the teaching that the great Zen master Hakuin gave when he said, "Not knowing is most intimate." Kenshin did not need to know every passenger's story, did not need to solve their problems, did not need to take on their suffering as his own. He simply needed to row them safely across. This particular morning began like countless others. The autumn sun rose over the eastern bank, painting the river in shades of copper and gold. Kenshin checked his ferry as he always did, testing the ropes, examining the planks, making sure everything was sound and safe. A few early travellers waited on the shore, a farmer with vegetables for market, 2 monks travelling to a distant temple, an old woman visiting family, and a merchant whose expensive robes and obvious impatience marked him as a man of importance. Kenshin helped them aboard with his usual courteous efficiency, accepting their coins, making sure they were settled safely. The farmer sat quietly with his baskets. The two monks settled into meditation, their eyes half closed. The old woman watched the water with a peaceful expression. But the merchant was different. Even before the ferry left the shore, the merchant was complaining. "This boat is too small. The planks are rough. They'll damage my robes. How long will this crossing take? I have important business on the other side. I cannot afford delays." Kenshin nodded politely and began to row, his oars dipping into the water with the rhythm he had known for 40 years. Pull and release, the steady heartbeat of the crossing. The river flowed beneath them, indifferent to the merchant's hurry, moving at its own eternal pace. "You're rowing too slowly," the merchant said, his voice sharp with irritation. "Surely you can go faster than this. I will pay you extra if you can get me across more quickly." Kenshin continued rowing at the same steady pace. "The river has its own speed, honored guest. We work with it, not against it. We will arrive at the proper time." This answer only inflamed the merchant further. "The proper time? The proper time was an hour ago. Do you know who I am? Do you know what deals I am missing while I sit on this miserable boat? The proper time is now, immediately, faster." The other passengers shifted uncomfortably. The farmer looked down at his vegetables. The monks deepened their meditation. The old woman watched Kenshin's face with interest, as if she could see something there worth studying. Kenshin rowed. Pull and release, pull and release. His face remained calm, his breathing steady, his movements unchanged. Inside, he felt the merchant's anger like a storm wind, not because it affected him, but because he noticed it, the way he noticed all weather, with awareness but without attachment. "Are you listening to me?" the merchant demanded, his voice rising. "I am speaking to you. I am telling you to row faster. What kind of ferryman are you, that you ignore your passengers? What kind of service is this?" Still, Kenshin rowed. His oars found the water, pulled through it, lifted, and found it again. His breath matched his rowing. His attention remained on the crossing, not on the merchant's words, not on defending himself, not on getting angry in return, but simply on the work of carrying these people safely across the water. The merchant stood up, making the boat rock. "I have never encountered such insolence, such disrespect. I will report you to the authorities. I will make sure you lose your license to operate this ferry. Do you understand me?" "Please sit down, honored guest," Kenshin said quietly. "Standing makes the boat unstable. We must keep everyone safe." "Safe? Safe?" The merchant's face was red now, his hands clenched into fists. "I'll tell you what's not safe. Your complete incompetence, your laziness, your refusal to provide proper service. I am a man of influence. I can ruin you. I can make sure you never work on this river again." Kenshin rowed. The far shore was drawing closer now, perhaps halfway across. The merchant's rage had reached a crescendo, and he paced the small deck of the ferry, ranting about everything. The ferryman's slowness, the boat's condition, the price of the crossing, the state of service in the province, the decline of respect, the impossibility of getting anything done properly anymore. His voice echoed across the water, disturbing ducks that had been floating peacefully nearby, sending them flapping into the air. And through it all, Kenshin rowed, not with gritted teeth or clenched jaw, not with resentment building in his chest, not with arguments forming in his mind about what he should say, what he wanted to say, what the merchant deserved to hear. He simply rowed, his attention on the oars, on the water, on the far shore, gradually approaching, on the simple work he had been doing for 4 decades. The Buddha had taught, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Kenshin had heard this teaching once, long ago, from a monk he had ferried across. He had never forgotten it, because he had seen it proven true countless times on this river. He had watched people carry their anger across the water and back again, drinking that poison day after day, expecting it to harm someone else, while it only corroded their own hearts. But he had also learned something else, something the teaching implied but did not say directly. You do not have to drink poison just because someone offers it to you. The merchant was offering him anger, offering him insult, offering him the opportunity to engage in combat. And Kenshin was simply not accepting the offer, not refusing it with resistance, not rejecting it with counter-anger, but simply letting it pass by like the current flowing past the hull of the boat. The old woman watching him smiled slightly, as if she understood. The merchant's rage continued, but something was beginning to change. Like a fire that burns through all its fuel, the anger was starting to consume itself. The merchant's voice grew hoarse, his pacing slowed, his accusations became repetitive. He was running out of steam, exhausting himself against Kenshin's immovable calm, the way waves exhaust themselves against a rock that will not fight back, will not move, will simply remain what it is. "Well?" the merchant finally demanded, his voice cracking with fatigue. "Have you nothing to say? No defense? No apology? No acknowledgement of your failures?" Kenshin looked at him for the first time since the tirade began, and his eyes were clear, without hardness, without judgment, without any trace of the merchant's anger reflected back at him. "The crossing is nearly complete, honored guest," he said softly. "We will reach the far shore in just a few moments. I hope your business there goes well." The simple kindness in those words, the complete absence of reciprocal anger, seemed to crack something in the merchant. His face went through a series of changes: confusion, shame, something that might have been the first hint of self-awareness. He sat down heavily, suddenly quiet, looking out at the water. The ferry reached the far shore. Kenshin secured it with practiced movements and helped each passenger disembark, the farmer with his vegetables thanking him quietly, the two monks bowing with palms together, the old woman who paused to look into Kenshin's eyes and say, "You have learned well, ferryman. You carry people but not their burdens." The merchant was last. He stood on the deck, hesitating, as if there was something he wanted to say. Finally, he stepped off the boat without a word, but before he walked away, he turned back. His face was different now. The rage had burned out, leaving something raw and more real behind. He began, then stopped. "You must think me a terrible person." "I think you are having a difficult morning," Kenshin said. "I hope your afternoon is better." The merchant blinked, as if surprised by this simple humanity. "I lost a valuable contract yesterday," he said, the words coming out as if unbidden. "My largest client. It was my own fault. I was too aggressive, too demanding. And this morning, I learned my daughter is ill. I am hurrying to her, but also running from my shame, and I took it out on you. You, who have done nothing but your job well and calmly." Kenshin nodded. "The river accepts all waters, rain and tears, clean and muddy. It does not judge. It simply flows. We all carry our troubles sometimes. The question is whether we let them poison us and everyone we meet, or whether we find a way to set them down, even if just for a moment." The merchant stood there, silent, and something shifted in his face. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you not take on what he's thrown at you? How do you stay so calm?" Kenshin smiled, a smile like sunlight on water. "Because I know that your anger is yours, not mine. Your trouble is yours, not mine. I can have compassion for your suffering without making it my suffering. I can see your pain without absorbing it. The river taught me this. It touches everything that enters it, but it does not become what it touches. The water remains water, even when carrying all manner of things across its surface. Master Hakuin taught," Kenshin continued, surprising himself by quoting the teaching that a monk had once shared with him, "Not knowing is most intimate. I do not need to know all your troubles to serve you. I do not need to fix your life to row you across the river. The most intimate thing I can offer is simply to be present, to do my work well, and to remain stable so that the boat does not capsize when storms arise, even storms of emotion." The merchant looked at him for a long moment. "I wish I had your peace." "It is not mine to give," Kenshin said, "but it is yours to find. Perhaps start by not carrying yesterday's losses into today's moments. Perhaps notice when you are drinking poison and expecting others to die from it. Perhaps forgive yourself for being human, for having troubles, for sometimes failing. And perhaps, honored guest, Check on your daughter. She needs you present, not consumed by shame or anger." The merchant bowed deeply, a real bow, humble and sincere. "Thank you, ferryman. You have given me more than a crossing today." He walked away, his steps slower now, more thoughtful, and Kenshin watched him go with the same compassionate detachment he brought to all his passengers. He hoped the man would find peace. He hoped the daughter would be well, but he did not carry those hopes as burdens. He simply offered them, like prayers released to the wind, and then turned his attention back to the river. New passengers were waiting for the return journey. A mother with 2 small children, a traveling peddler, a young couple holding hands. Kenshin helped them aboard, accepted their coins, made sure they were settled safely. The children were excited, pointing at fish in the water, asking questions about everything. The ferryman answered them patiently, his voice warm, his attention fully present. As he began to row back across the river, the mother said, "You seem like a peaceful man, ferryman. Is it always this calm on your boat?" Kenshin smiled, remembering the merchant's rage just minutes before, the storm that had passed over the same boat, leaving no trace in the wood or in his heart. "The river carries all kinds of weather," he said, "but the boat remains steady. That is all we can do, remain steady and keep rowing, no matter what storms arise." He rowed across the river 4 more times that day, carrying farmers and merchants, monks and mothers, the hurried and the patient, the kind and the difficult. Some thanked him warmly, some barely acknowledged him. Some were lost in their own troubles, some were present and joyful, and Kenshin carried them all across with the same steady presence, the same calm attention, the same refusal to absorb the poison that some offered, the same openness to the kindness that others shared. As the sun set and he secured his ferry for the night, he thought about the merchant and hoped the man had found his daughter well. He thought about all the passengers he had carried over 40 years, all the stories he had glimpsed, all the suffering and joy that had crossed his boat, and he felt grateful not for being special or enlightened or above it all, but simply for learning, slowly and through much practice, how to touch life without clinging to it, how to serve without absorbing, how to witness suffering without drowning in it. The river flowed on in the darkness, patient and eternal, carrying everything and keeping nothing, touching all and remaining itself. Kenshin locked the gate to the dock and walked home through the gathering night, his heart as clear as the water he spent his days crossing, again and again and again. The ferryman understood what the merchant had yet to learn, that some waters we must cross alone, and others, well, let me tell you about 2 monks on a very different journey, where the river they encountered would teach a lesson about what we carry long after the crossing is complete. One monk walked light, the other heavy with thought. But let me take you to the beginning of their journey, to a monastery in the mountains where 2 monks named Tanzan and Ekido prepared to travel together to a distant temple, where important teachings would be given by a visiting master. Tanzan was the younger of the 2, perhaps 30 years old, with a round face that smiled easily and eyes that noticed everything with gentle curiosity. He had been a monk for 10 years, and his practice was characterized by a kind of fluid spontaneity, a willingness to meet each moment as it came without too much holding on to rules or rigidity. Aikido was older, perhaps 50, thin and austere, with a face that rarely smiled, and eyes that seemed always to be measuring, judging, ensuring that everything was being done properly. He had been a monk for 30 years, and his practice was built on discipline, on following the precepts exactly, on maintaining the purity of the monastic code without compromise. He was respected for his strictness, for his unwavering commitment to every detail of the rules. The 2 monks had been chosen to make this journey together. Perhaps their abbot hoped that each might learn something from the other, that Tanzan might gain some of Aikido's discipline, and Aikido might absorb some of Tanzan's warmth. Or perhaps the abbot simply smiled to himself, knowing what might happen when rigidity meets fluidity on a long road. They set out early one autumn morning, their few possessions in cloth bundles on their backs, their robes clean and proper, their bowls polished for accepting alms along the way. The rules for traveling monks were clear. They should walk in meditation, speak little, avoid unnecessary contact with lay people, and especially they should avoid all contact with women. This last rule was particularly strict. A monk should not speak to a woman alone, should not touch a woman, should not even look at a woman with interest. This was to protect both the monk's practice and the woman's reputation. Aikido walked with his eyes mostly downcast, his lips moving in silent recitation of sutras, his attention on maintaining proper form in every step. Tanzan walked with his eyes open to the world, noticing the way the morning light caught the autumn leaves, hearing the birds calling, feeling the cool air on his face, present to the journey itself rather than focused on doing it correctly. They walked in silence for most of the morning, as was proper. When they encountered other travelers, they bowed politely and continued on. When they passed through villages, they walked with heads bowed, accepting any alms offered, but not lingering. Everything was as it should be. It was afternoon when they came to the river. It was not a large river, but the recent rains had swollen it, turning it muddy and swift. Normally there would be a bridge, but the bridge had been damaged in a storm and not yet repaired. A few stepping stones remained, but the water rushed over them, making them slippery and dangerous. For two monks with good balance and no burdens beyond their small packs, it was crossable with care. But standing on the near bank, looking at the rushing water with obvious distress, was a young woman in an expensive silk kimono. She was clearly a person of some wealth, probably traveling to visit family, and she had been caught by the river's sudden rise. Her kimono was too fine, too delicate for wading through muddy water. Her shoes were elegant but impractical. She stood there, shifting from foot to foot, looking at the water and then back the way she had come, trapped between destinations. Aikido saw her and immediately looked away, walking slightly to the side to pass by without acknowledging her presence. This was correct, according to the rules. They were monks. She was a woman. There should be no interaction. But Tanzan paused. He looked at the woman's distress, at the expensive kimono that would be ruined by the muddy water, at her obvious uncertainty about what to do. He looked at the river, gauging its depth and current. He looked at his companion, who was already moving away, rigid in his correctness. And then, without hesitation, Tanzan walked over to the woman. "Excuse me," he said, his voice kind. "You need to cross?" The woman looked startled, then relieved. "Yes, but my kimono will be destroyed. And the current is so strong, I'm afraid I'll fall." Tanzan nodded. Then, before Aikido could protest, before even considering the rule he was about to break, he said, "Please, allow me to help you." And he picked her up carefully, respectfully, holding her safely in his arms, and waded into the river. Aikido stood frozen on the bank, his face a mask of shock and horror. A monk, touching a woman, picking her up, carrying her in his arms. It was a violation of the most fundamental precepts, a breaking of the rules that governed everything, a scandal that could disgrace them both. Tanzan moved steadily through the water, his footing sure despite the current, his attention fully on keeping the woman safe and her kimono dry. The water came up to his thighs, cold and pulling at his robes, but he remained stable, and in a few moments he had reached the far bank. He set the woman down gently, making sure her feet were on solid ground. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much. You are very kind." Tanzan bowed. "Please travel safely." He waded back across the river where Aikido stood waiting with a face like thunder. Without speaking, the two monks continued their journey. But now the silence between them was different, heavy, charged, thick with Aikido's disapproval. They walked for an hour, and Aikido's silence grew more oppressive with each step. Tanzan could feel it like a weight. But he said nothing, simply walking, simply being present to the road, to the afternoon light, to the journey. They walked for 2 hours, and Aikido's body language spoke volumes. The stiffness of his shoulders, the sharpness of his steps, the way he walked slightly apart, as if not wanting to be contaminated by association with one who had broken the rules so flagrantly. They walked for 3 hours, stopping at a small shrine to rest and take water. Still Aikido said nothing, but his silence was screaming. Finally, as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, he could contain it no longer. "How could you do that?" he burst out, his voice sharp with outrage. "How could you touch that woman? Pick her up? Carry her in your arms? Do you not know the rules? Do you not understand the precepts? We are monks. We have vowed to avoid all such contact. You have broken your vows. You have disgraced yourself and the monastery. And, Brother Ekido," Tanzan interrupted gently, "I set the woman down on the other side of the river 3 hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" The words hung in the air like a bell that has been struck, reverberating, impossible to unhear. Ekido stopped walking. His mouth opened and closed. His face went through a series of changes: anger, confusion, defensive justification, and then, slowly, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Tanzan had picked up the woman and carried her across the river. The action had taken perhaps 5 minutes. Then he had set her down and released her completely, continuing on his way with no attachment to what had happened, no pride in his kindness, no lingering on the rule he had broken. For him, it was done, complete, in the past. But Ekido had been carrying that woman for 3 hours, carrying her in his mind, in his judgment, in his outrage. He had been thinking about her, dwelling on the incident, building it larger and larger in his thoughts until it filled his entire consciousness. The woman was long gone, continuing her journey, probably not thinking about the kind monk who had helped her. But in Ekido's mind, he was still carrying her, still stuck in that moment by the river, unable to move forward because he could not let go of what had already passed. The Buddha had taught, in the end, only 3 things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. Tanzan had helped someone in need and then let it go. Ekido was clinging to his judgment, his righteousness, his need to be right about the rules, and in that clinging, he was creating his own suffering. Ekido began, then stopped. His shoulders, which had been rigid with righteous anger, slowly sagged. "I have been thinking about it ever since," he admitted quietly. "Thinking about the rule you broke, thinking about what the abbot would say, thinking about how wrong it was." "And while you were thinking all those thoughts," Tanzan said gently, "were you here? Were you present to this beautiful afternoon? Did you notice the persimmons heavy on the trees we passed? Did you hear the farmer singing in his field? Did you see the hawks circling overhead? Or were you back at that river, carrying that woman, carrying your judgment, carrying the past?" Ekido looked around as if seeing the road for the first time in hours. They had walked through a beautiful landscape, and he had seen none of it. They had passed people who had bowed to them respectfully, and he had barely noticed. The world had been offering itself to him moment by moment, and he had been absent, lost in his mind, imprisoned by his attachment to what had already happened and could not be changed. "But the rule," he said, though his voice was weaker now, less certain. "You broke the precepts. That matters, does it?" Tanzan asked. "The precepts exist to reduce suffering, to help us live with wisdom and compassion. I saw a person in need. I helped them. Then I released the action completely. You saw me help someone, and you have been suffering about it for 3 hours, creating a story about it, building it into something to be angry about. Which of us has created more suffering?" This was the heart of it, the koan that the situation presented. The rules said not to touch women. Tanzan had broken the rule to reduce suffering, to offer help to someone in distress, and then had let the action go completely, carrying nothing forward. Ekido had followed the rule by not touching the woman himself, but he had created enormous suffering by clinging to judgment, by carrying the incident for hours, by letting his mind spin endless stories about right and wrong, proper and improper, pure and defiled. "Master Lingji taught," Tanzan continued, settling onto a rock by the roadside, "that we should not be slaves to anything, not even to the Buddha, not even to the teachings. When we hold the rules so tightly that we lose sight of their purpose, when we cling to correctness so rigidly that we cannot respond with compassion to the living moment before us, then the rules have become another burden, another thing we carry unnecessarily." Ekido sat down heavily on another rock. He looked exhausted, and Tanzan realized that carrying all that judgment, all that anger, all that righteousness for 3 hours had been more tiring than carrying an actual person across a river. "I thought I was being a good monk," Aikido said quietly, "following the rules precisely, maintaining discipline." "You are a good monk," Tanzan said. "Your dedication is genuine. Your discipline has value. But perhaps there is a difference between discipline and rigidity, between following the spirit of the teachings and clinging to the letter." The woman needed help. "I helped her. The rule exists to prevent attachment, lust, and exploitation. There was none of that. There was only a human being helping another human being and then letting it go. Completely." "Can you let it go now, brother? Can you set her down?" Aikido sat in silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, something in him seemed to release. His shoulders dropped. His face softened. The rigid line of his mouth relaxed into something more human, more vulnerable. "I set her down," he said quietly. And then, with a small, surprised laugh, "She was getting heavy." Tanzan smiled. "Very heavy, I imagine. Judgment always is. We think we are carrying truth or righteousness or proper standards, but what we are really carrying is just weight, just burden, just suffering we create for ourselves by not knowing how to let things go." They sat together as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves. A monk and a monk, brothers on the path, both learning, both teaching, both necessary. The one who knows when to act despite the rules, and the one who is learning when to release despite the mind's insistence on holding on. "Will you tell the abbot what I did?" Tanzan asked, curious but not worried. Aikido thought about it. "What would I tell him? That you helped someone and then let it go? Or that I carried my judgment for 3 hours and learned that letting go is harder than picking up? I think my story is less flattering than yours." "Both stories are true," Tanzan said. "Both have teaching in them. I broke a rule but maintained the principle behind it, avoiding attachment. You followed the rule but broke the principle. You became very attached to your idea of how things should be." "How do you do it?" Aikido asked. "How do you act and then release? How do you not carry things?" "Practice," Tanzan said simply. "And perhaps a different kind of discipline than you've been taught. Not the discipline of never breaking rules, but the discipline of never holding on to anything. Not accomplishment, not failure, not pride in being correct, not shame in making mistakes. Everything arises, everything passes. If we can touch it lightly and let it go, we suffer less. If we grip it tightly, trying to hold on to it or push it away, we suffer more." As they rose and continued their journey, walking now in a companionable silence rather than a heavy one, Aikido found himself noticing things he had missed before. The way the evening light made the grass look golden, the sound of water running in a stream beside the road, the scent of wood smoke from a distant farmhouse, the present moment which he had abandoned for 3 hours while living in the past. He was still a disciplined monk. He would still follow the precepts with care, but perhaps, he thought, he could hold them a little more lightly, could remember that the point was not rigid correctness, but genuine freedom, not accumulating merit through rule following, but releasing attachment to everything, even attachment to being right. That night, they stayed at a small temple, sharing a simple meal with the resident monks. When asked about their journey, Tanzan said only that it had been beautiful and uneventful. Aikido said nothing, but he smiled a real smile, perhaps the first in years, and in that smile was the lightness of having finally set down a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. One monk walked light, the other heavy with thought, and this reminds me of a student who thought too much about his enlightenment, forgetting to notice the light already surrounding him, forgetting that what we seek is sometimes found only when we stop seeking. What we seek is already here. But let me tell you about a student who spent years searching for it everywhere except the one place it had always been waiting, right where he stood, in the simple, ordinary moments he kept dismissing as too mundane to contain the truth he craved. His name was Daichi, and he had come to the monastery with a burning desire that consumed him day and night. He wanted enlightenment. He wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He wanted the sudden awakening he had read about in the ancient texts, the profound realization that would transform everything, the experience of ultimate truth that would set him free from all suffering forever. He was 25 years old when he arrived at the mountain monastery, leaving behind a comfortable life in the city, a family that did not understand his choice, and a promising career that seemed meaningless in the face of his spiritual hunger. He had read every text he could find. He had studied the stories of the great masters who had achieved sudden enlightenment. Huainan hearing a single sutra and awakening instantly, Hakuin crying out, "All things are from the beginning void," and realizing the truth in a flash, Dogen understanding that practice and enlightenment are not two separate things, but one seamless reality. Daichi wanted that. He wanted the flash, the breakthrough, the moment when everything would suddenly make sense and he would be free, and he was willing to work for it with every fiber of his being. So he meditated. He meditated before dawn and after dusk. He meditated during the scheduled meditation periods and during his free time. He meditated until his legs went numb and his back screamed with pain. He meditated through hunger and cold and exhaustion, believing that if he just tried hard enough, if he just pushed far enough, enlightenment would come crashing through like lightning through a dark sky. He attended every teaching, hanging on every word the master spoke, analyzing each phrase for the hidden key that would unlock everything. He studied koans obsessively, turning them over in his mind day and night. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your original face before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? He wrestled with these questions like a man fighting for his life, certain that if he could just crack their code, enlightenment would be his. He performed prostrations, hundreds of them, thousands of them, bowing until his forehead was bruised and his knees ached, believing that such dedication would surely earn him the breakthrough he sought. He went on solitary retreats, sitting in a small hut for days at a time with minimal food and water, pushing himself to the edge of endurance, waiting for the moment when his small self would shatter and the great truth would pour through. Years passed, 1 year, then 2, then 3, and enlightenment remained frustratingly out of reach. Sometimes Daichi thought he felt it approaching a moment of clarity during meditation, a sudden understanding while reading a text, a feeling of spaciousness that lasted for a few precious minutes. But then it would slip away, and he would be back to striving, seeking, pushing, trying to recapture what had briefly appeared and vanished. He grew thin from fasting. His eyes developed a slightly wild look from lack of sleep. He became known among the other monks as the one who tried hardest, who wanted enlightenment most desperately, who never seemed to rest in his pursuit. Some admired his dedication, others worried about him. The master simply watched, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when the student would be ready to learn what he needed to learn. There was another resident at the monastery, though Daichi barely noticed him. This was an old orange cat named Bodhi, who had appeared one day and simply stayed, as cats do when they find a place that suits them. Bodhi was fat and lazy and spent most of his time sleeping in whatever patch of sunlight he could find. When he wasn't sleeping, he was grooming himself with meticulous care, or watching birds with calm interest, or purring when someone scratched behind his ears. The monks loved Bodhi. They made sure he was fed. They let him sleep in the meditation hall, where he would sometimes stretch out right in the middle of the floor, completely at ease, perfectly content. But Daichi had no time for the cat. He was pursuing enlightenment. He had no energy to waste on such trivial distractions. One autumn afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meditation session, during which Daichi had spent every moment trying desperately to break through to some profound realization and had achieved nothing but mental exhaustion, he emerged from the meditation hall in a state of near despair. 3 years. 3 years of intense practice, and he felt no closer to enlightenment than the day he had arrived. What was wrong with him? Why couldn't he achieve what the ancient masters had achieved? Was he not trying hard enough? Should he meditate more, sleep less, push harder? He walked to the monastery garden in his agitation, his mind spinning with these questions, barely seeing where he was going. And there, on the stone path, sprawled in a perfect rectangle of afternoon sunlight, was Bodhi. The cat was lying on his back, all four paws in the air, completely relaxed, his orange fur glowing in the light. His eyes were half closed in that expression of absolute contentment that cats achieve so effortlessly. He was purring. Daichi could hear it from several feet away, a deep rumbling sound of perfect satisfaction. Daichi stopped. For some reason, he found himself actually looking at the cat, really looking, perhaps for the first time. Bodhi wasn't doing anything. He wasn't trying to achieve anything. He wasn't striving or seeking or pushing himself towards some distant goal. He was simply lying in the sun, being a cat, completely present to this moment of warmth and comfort, utterly at peace. And something in Daichi's mind, stretched taut as a bowstring from 3 years of relentless striving, suddenly snapped, not broke, but released, the way tension releases when you finally stop pulling. He sat down on the path, right there next to the cat. Bodhi opened one eye, regarded him calmly, then closed it again, his purring continuing uninterrupted. Daichi felt tears on his face, though he couldn't have said why he was crying. "You're enlightened," he said to the cat, "aren't you?" Bodhi's purr deepened slightly, as if an acknowledgement, though of course the cat had no concept of enlightenment or non-enlightenment. He was simply being what he was, doing what he was doing, with no gap between being and doing, no separation between self and moment, no striving towards something other than what was already here. The great Zen master Huineng had taught, "From the beginning, not a thing is." Daichi had read these words 100 times. He had meditated on them, analyzed them, tried to understand them with his intellect. But sitting there next to the cat, he suddenly got it not with his mind, but with his whole being. There was nothing to achieve. There had never been anything to achieve. Enlightenment was not something to attain in the future through heroic effort. It was not a state to reach after years of struggling. It was not a treasure hidden somewhere that needed to be found through elaborate seeking. It was here. It had always been here. It was the sunlight falling on the path, the sound of the cat purring, the feeling of the stone beneath him, the breath moving in and out of his lungs, the simple fact of being alive in this moment, exactly as it was. He had been like a fish swimming frantically through the ocean, desperately searching for water. The tears came harder now, tears of relief, of recognition, of something that felt like coming home after a long journey. All those years of striving, all that effort, all that desperate seeking, and what he had been looking for was here all along. In every moment he had dismissed as ordinary. In every simple action he had rushed through to get to the real. Practice. In every experience he had overlooked because at sea, made too mundane to contain the profound truth he sought. He thought of all the times he had fetched water from the well, his mind always elsewhere, always on his meditation, his practice, his pursuit of enlightenment. He had never really fetched water. He had never felt the bucket's weight, never really seen the water's surface reflecting the sky, never been present to the simple act of drawing water. He thought of all the meals he had eaten without tasting them, all the paths he had walked without seeing them, all the moments he had spent physically present but mentally absent, always chasing something in the future, always believing that the present moment was just a stepping stone to the real moment, the enlightened moment that would come later if he just tried hard enough. The Buddha had taught, there is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. But Daichi had been treating every moment as a means to an end, as something to get through on the way to the goal. He had made his whole life into a waiting room, believing that real life, enlightened life, would begin once he achieved the breakthrough. And in doing so, he had missed the actual life that was happening all along. Bodhi rolled over and stood up, stretching with that luxurious fullness that cats bring to stretching, every muscle engaged, every movement complete. Then he walked over to Daichi and rubbed against his leg, purring, fully present to this simple interaction, asking nothing, offering nothing except this moment of contact. Daichi reached out and stroked the cat's back, And for perhaps the first time in 3 years, he was completely here for it. He felt the softness of the fur, the warmth of the small body, the vibration of the purr. He wasn't thinking about enlightenment. He wasn't trying to make this a spiritual experience. He was just petting a cat, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Later, when the meditation bell rang for evening sitting, Daichi walked to the hall slowly, noticing things he had never noticed before. The way the stones of the path were each unique, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the smell of incense drifting from the temple, the sound of wind in the pine trees, the feeling of his own feet touching the earth with each step. He took his seat in the meditation hall. Bodhi was already there, curled up in his favorite spot near the altar, sleeping peacefully. Daichi sat, but now his sitting was different. He wasn't trying to achieve anything. He wasn't pushing towards some breakthrough. He was simply sitting, breath coming in, breath going out, thoughts arising and passing like clouds across the sky. Everything just as it was, nothing lacking, needed. The master walked through the hall, as he did each evening, observing the students. When he passed Daichi, he paused. He looked at the young monk's face, the relaxation where there had been tension, the peace where there had been desperate striving, the simple presence where there had been constant mental activity. The master smiled and moved on, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. The student had finally stopped seeking long enough to find what he had always had. After meditation, Daichi was assigned to kitchen duty washing dishes, a simple task he had always resented because it took time away from his real practice. But tonight, he washed dishes with full attention, the warm water on his hands, the smooth ceramic of the bowls, the way the soap formed bubbles that caught the light. There was no enlightenment separate from this washing. This washing was itself complete, itself whole, itself enough. In the following days, everything changed and nothing changed. Daichi still meditated, but now meditation wasn't a struggle towards something. It was just sitting, just being. He still studied, but now study wasn't a desperate search for the secret key. It was just learning, just opening to what was being offered. He still worked chopping wood, carrying water, sweeping paths. But now work wasn't a distraction from practice. Work was practice. Walking was practice. Eating was practice. Everything was practice, because practice and life were not two different things. The other monks noticed the change. The wild look in his eyes was gone. The tension in his shoulders had released. He laughed more easily. He actually saw them when he passed them, actually responded when they spoke, instead of being lost in his own internal quest. "What happened to you?" one monk finally asked. "You seem different." Daichi thought about it. How could he explain? "I stopped trying to become enlightened and started being alive," he finally said. "I realized I was already everything I was seeking to become." One evening, a visiting monk came to the monastery and gathered the students for a teaching. "The Buddha nature," he said, "is already complete in each of you. You don't need to add anything to it or achieve anything to have it. You simply need to recognize it, to wake up to what has always been true." Daichi smiled. Yes, he had spent 3 years trying to become what he already was, trying to find what he had never lost, trying to reach a destination where he had always been standing. That night, before sleep, he visited the garden one more time. Bodhi was there, of course, sitting on the stone wall, looking at the moon. Daichi sat beside him, and together they looked at the moon. A cat and a man, both Buddha nature, both complete, both lacking nothing. "Thank you, teacher," Daichi whispered to the cat. Bodhi blinked slowly. "That gesture cats make, that looks like a smile," and returned his gaze to the moon. The water in that bucket reflected the sky, just as it did in a well in another village, where a woman was about to learn the nature of depth and discover that the deepest wells sometimes exist, not in the earth, but in the mind that cannot stop drawing from them. When her hands finally unclenched, she felt the texture of the rope, the weight of the water, the gift of now. But let me take you back to the beginning, to a village where a woman named Yuki lived a life that was comfortable in every way except one: she could not stop worrying. Yuki was 40 years old, married to a kind husband who worked as a carpenter. mother to 2 healthy children who brought her joy and exasperation in equal measure. Her family had enough to eat, a solid roof over their heads, neighbors who cared about them, and no particular hardships that would explain the constant knot of anxiety that lived in Yuki's chest like a stone she had swallowed years ago and never managed to digest. But the anxiety was there, always there, a low hum of dread that colored every moment of her life. And nowhere was it more pronounced than in the simple daily task of drawing water from the village well. The well was deep and old, lined with stones that glistened with moisture even in the driest seasons. It had served the village for generations, never running dry, always providing clean, cold water that tasted faintly of minerals and earth. Every morning and evening, Yuki would walk to the well with her wooden bucket, lower it down on its rope, feel the splash as it hit the water far below, and then pull it up hand over hand, the rope rough against her palms. And every single time, her mind would fill with catastrophic visions. What if the rope broke? The bucket would fall into the darkness, lost forever, and she would have to explain to her husband that she had lost their only bucket, and he would be disappointed, and they would have no money to buy another, and the children would go thirsty, and the neighbors would judge her for her carelessness. And what if she lost her grip? The rope would slip through her hands, the bucket would plummet, the precious water would be lost, and she would have to draw again, wasting time, making herself late for preparing the evening meal, and her husband would come home to no food, and he would wonder what kind of wife cannot even manage to keep the household running. And what if the well itself collapsed? The ancient stones could give way any day now, could tumble inward, could block the water source forever, and then what would the village do? They would have to carry water from the river much farther away, and in winter the river would freeze, and they would have no water at all, and people would sicken, and her children would suffer, and it would somehow be her fault for not warning anyone, for not doing something to prevent it, even tea. Half. What could she possibly do about a well that had stood for 100 years? What if one of her children came to the well alone and fell in? She could see it so vividly, small hands reaching for the rope, a loss of balance, a cry cut short by the terrible splash far below, the darkness swallowing what she loved most in the world. Never mind that she had told them 1,000 times never to come to the well alone. Never mind that the well had a wall around it specifically to prevent such accidents. Never mind that in all her years in this village, no child had ever fallen into the well. In her mind, the catastrophe was vivid and real and always just about to happen. Every morning, these visions. Every evening, these fears. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the simple act of drawing water became a torture of anticipated disasters that never came true, but felt absolutely real in the moment of imagining them. Her husband noticed, of course. "Yuki," he would say gently, "the well is sound. The rope is strong. I checked it myself just last week. Everything is fine." But his reassurances did nothing. The catastrophes in her mind were not responsive to logic or evidence. They were like weeds that grew faster than she could pull them, like clouds that gathered even on sunny days, like shadows that existed independent of any actual darkness. Her neighbors noticed too. They saw the way her hands clenched white-knuckled on the rope, the way her face tensed as she drew the water, the way she examined every inch of the bucket and rope as if looking for proof of the disaster she knew was coming. Some of them thought her strange, some felt sorry for her. None knew how to help. One evening in late autumn, as Yuki approached the well with her usual dread churning in her stomach, she found an old woman already there, sitting on the low stone wall that surrounded the well. The woman was elderly, her face deeply lined but her eyes bright and alert. She wore simple traveling clothes and had a small pack beside her. A wanderer, perhaps, or a pilgrim passing through the village. "Good evening, grandmother," Yuki said politely, using the respectful term for an elder. "Would you like water? I can draw some for you." "That's kind of you," the old woman said, "but I've already drunk my fill. I'm just resting here, enjoying the evening. It's peaceful at the well, don't you think?" Peaceful. Yuki almost laughed at the word. The well was many things to her: necessary, familiar, dreaded, But peaceful was not one of them. She lowered her bucket, and as she did, her hands began to shake. The rope felt thinner than usual, more fragile. Surely it would break today. Today would be the day. She could feel it. The bucket splashed into the water far below, and she began to pull it up, her heart pounding with the certainty of impending disaster. "You're worried the rope will break," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. Yuki startled, nearly losing her grip. "How did you know?" "I can see it in your body, in your face. You're not drawing water. You're bracing for catastrophe." The bucket reached the top. Yuki pulled it over the wall, her hands still trembling. The water sloshed, and she imagined dropping the whole bucket, wasting everything, proving her incompetence to the stranger who already seemed to see too much. "I can't help it," Yuki said quietly. "Every time I come here, I imagine everything that could go wrong. The rope breaking, the bucket falling, the well collapsing, my children in danger. I know it's foolish, I know nothing bad has happened, but the thoughts come anyway, and they feel so real." The old woman nodded slowly. "Tell me, how many times have you drawn water from this well?" Yuki calculated. "Twice a day for how many years?" "Thousands of times, maybe tens of thousands." "And how many times has the rope broken?" "Never." "How many times has the bucket fallen?" "Never." "How many times has the well collapsed?" "Never." "How many times have your children fallen in?" "Never." The old woman smiled gently. "So you have spent tens of thousands of moments worrying about things that have never happened, and in doing so, you have turned a simple task into suffering." The Buddha taught, "The secret of health for both mind and body is not to mourn for the past, worry about the future, or anticipate troubles, but to live in the present moment wisely and earnestly. You draw water from this well, but you also draw endlessly from another well, the well of future suffering. And that well never runs dry as long as you keep lowering your bucket into it." Yuki set down her bucket and sat on the wall beside the old woman. The words struck something deep in her. She had never thought of her worry as a choice, as something she was actively doing. It felt like something that happened to her, that she was victim to. But the image of lowering a bucket into a well of imagined future suffering that resonated with a painful accuracy. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. "The thoughts just come. They feel so real, so urgent. How do I ignore them?" "You don't ignore them," the old woman said. "That's like trying to ignore a persistent child. The harder you try, the louder they become. Instead, you notice them. You see them for what they are, thoughts, not reality. Stories your mind tells, not facts about the world." She picked up a small pebble and dropped it into the well. They heard the splash, delayed from far below. "When you worry about the rope breaking, is the rope breaking?" "No." "When you worry about the bucket falling, is the bucket falling?" "No." "When you worry about your children being in danger, are they in danger?" "No." So the worry exists only in your mind. It's not happening in the world. It's happening in the story you're telling yourself about what might happen. Do you see the difference? Yuki thought about this. The rope was strong. She could feel its strength in her hands right now. The bucket was secure. The well was solid. Her children were safe at home. All of that was real, was actually happening. The catastrophes existed only in her mind. In the future she was imagining, in the story she was spinning about what could go wrong. Master Shunryu Suzuki taught, the old woman continued, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few. You have become an expert in catastrophe. Your mind knows every possible disaster so well that it can conjure them instantly, vividly. But what if you became a beginner again? What if you approached the well each time with fresh eyes, not knowing what will happen, open to the moment as it actually is? But things could go wrong, Yuki protested. The rope could break. Accidents do happen. Yes, the old woman agreed. Things could go wrong. The rope could break, though it's strong and well maintained. Your children could be in danger, though they're safe and careful. The well could collapse, though it stood for a century. Anything could happen. But here is the question. Does worrying about it prevent it? Does your anxiety make the rope stronger? Does your fear protect your children? Does your dread keep the well from collapsing? Yuki opened her mouth to say yes, because some part of her believed that her worry was a form of protection, that if she stayed vigilant enough in her anxiety, she could somehow prevent disaster through the sheer force of her concern. But she knew it wasn't true. Her worry had never prevented anything. It had only stolen the peace from thousands of moments. Worry is like paying interest on a debt you may never owe, the old woman said. You exhaust yourself with concerns about futures that mostly never arrive, and in doing so, you miss the only moment you actually have this one. They sat in silence for a while. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A cool breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere, a child laughed. Life was happening, right now, in all its ordinary beauty. And Yuki realized she almost never noticed it, because she was always somewhere else, some imagined future where everything had gone wrong. What should I do? She asked. How do I live with uncertainty without drowning in worry? The old woman gestured to the well. Draw water again, but this time be here while you do it. Feel the rope in your hands, actually feel it, its texture, its strength. Don't think about whether it might break. Just feel what it actually is right now. Lower the bucket and listen to it splash. Don't imagine catastrophes. Just listen to the actual sound. Pull the water up and feel the weight of it, the work of your muscles, the reality of this moment. Can you do that? Yuki nodded, though she felt uncertain. She picked up her bucket and approached the well. As she lowered it, her mind immediately began its familiar catastrophic predictions. But this time, when the thoughts came, she noticed them. I'm worrying about the rope breaking, she said aloud. Yes, the old woman confirmed. You're worrying. But is the rope breaking? And Yuki brought her attention back to her hands, to the actual sensation of the rope against her palms. It was rough, yes, but also strong, thick, real. She felt its texture instead of her story about its fragility. The bucket splashed below. Her mind wanted to worry about the well collapsing. I'm worrying about the well, she said. Yes, but is the well collapsing? No. And Yuki listened to the actual sound of the water, the way it echoed in the stone chamber below, the way the bucket bobbed and filled. She began to pull the bucket up. Her mind wanted to worry about losing her grip, about dropping everything. I'm worrying about dropping the bucket, she said. Yes, but are you dropping it? No. And Yuki felt the actual weight of the water, the way her arms worked, the way her feet were planted firmly on the ground. Hand over hand, breath by breath, she was drawing water. That was all. Just this. Just now. The bucket reached the top. She pulled it over the wall and set it down safely. Water sloshed gently inside. She had done it. Not without thoughts of catastrophe. They had come as they always did, but without being controlled by them, without letting them turn a simple task into torture. How do you feel? The old woman asked. Different, Yuki said, surprised. I still had the worried thoughts, but they didn't consume me. I could feel the difference between the thought the rope might break and the reality of the rope being strong. They're not the same thing. No, they're not. The thought is just a thought, ephemeral, empty, passing like a cloud. The reality is what's actually here. The more you practice returning to reality, to this moment, to what's actually happening rather than what might happen, the less power the worried thoughts will have. Yuki drew water one more time, practicing this new way of being present. The worried thoughts still came. Her mind had decades of practice in producing them, but now she recognized them for what they were. Stories, predictions, fears, not reality. And beneath the stories, reality was simpler, more direct, less catastrophic than her mind wanted to believe. When she had filled her bucket for the final time, she turned to thank the old woman. But the stranger was already gone, disappeared down the darkening road with her small pack, leaving only the memory of her teaching and the sound of water settling in the bucket. That night, Yuki told her husband what had happened. I've been drawing from 2 wells, she said. The real one, and the one in my mind full of imagined disasters. I want to stop drawing from the second well. How will you do that? He asked. by coming back to what's real, by noticing when I'm worrying and choosing to return to the present moment instead. It wasn't easy. Worry was an old habit, deeply grooved. The next morning, when she approached the well, the catastrophic thoughts came as strong as ever. But now she had a tool. She noticed them. "I'm worrying," she would say to herself, "but what's actually happening right now?" And she would feel the rope, hear the water, experience the moment as it actually was, not as her mind feared it might become. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, gradually, the well became less frightening. The simple act of drawing water became, occasionally, just drawing water. Not a drama, not a catastrophe, not a test she might fail, but a task, ordinary and complete in itself. She still worried sometimes old patterns don't disappear overnight. But now she knew the difference between a worried thought and reality. She knew how to let the thought pass like a cloud while remaining grounded in what was actually happening. And in that grounding, she found something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not because her life had become safer, not because the rope had become stronger, not because the well was less deep, but because she had stopped paying interest on debts she might never owe. She had stopped drowning in the well of future suffering and had learned to stand on the solid ground of now. When her hands finally unclenched, she felt the texture of the rope, the weight of the water, the gift of now, and somewhere in the mountains, a young hermit was learning about a different kind of wealth, discovering that the less you own, sometimes the more you have. The hermit smiled at the moon, and the moon smiled back. But let me take you to the beginning of that evening, to a small bamboo hut nestled high in the mountains where a hermit named Ryokan had chosen to live with almost nothing, finding in that nothingness a wealth that no amount of possessions ever provided. Ryokan had not always been a hermit. Once he had been a monk in a prestigious monastery, learned and respected, following the rigorous schedules and elaborate rituals that marked the days. But something in him had grown restless with the formality, with the accumulation of knowledge and status that seemed to contradict the very teachings of simplicity and non-attachment. So one spring morning, he had bowed to his teacher, gathered his few possessions, and walked into the mountains to live as the ancient masters had lived, simply, freely, with nothing between himself and the natural world. That had been 20 years ago. Now Ryokan lived in a hut he had built himself from bamboo and thatch, so small that he could barely stand upright inside. His possessions numbered exactly 3: a wooden bowl for food and water, a simple robe that he washed in the stream and wore while it dried on his body, and the hut itself, which barely qualified as a possession since it belonged more to the mountain than to him. He had no money, no savings, no stored food, no insurance against hard times. He lived on what the villagers in the valley below occasionally offered him, on wild plants he gathered, on nuts and berries and mountain vegetables that grew without cultivation. In winter, he was cold. In summer, he was hot. When food was scarce, he was hungry. When the roof leaked, he got wet. And yet he smiled more than any wealthy merchant, laughed more than any comfortable householder, felt richer than any man with storehouses full of rice and warehouses full of goods. The Buddha had taught, in generosity and helping others, one frees oneself. Ryokan had discovered this truth not through reading it in sutras, but through living it every day. The less he owned, the less he had to protect, to maintain, to worry about. The less he accumulated, the more freely he could give. And in giving everything away, he found he had everything he needed. On this particular autumn evening, as the sun was setting and the air was turning crisp with the promise of winter, Ryokan sat outside his hut, watching the light fade from the sky. He had eaten a simple meal, some mountain vegetables and a small rice ball that a farmer had given him that morning. His stomach was not full, but it was not empty. Enough. Always, somehow, enough. As the darkness deepened, he heard footsteps on the mountain path, unusual at this hour. Few people climbed to his hut even in daylight, and never in the evening. He waited, curious but not alarmed. He had nothing worth stealing, nothing to fear losing. The first visitor appeared from the trees, a young man, thin and ragged, with desperate eyes and the look of someone who had been traveling hard. He approached the hut cautiously, saw Ryokan sitting peacefully in the gathering darkness, and stopped. "Master," the young man said, his voice rough with hunger, "I have not eaten in 2 days. Do you have any food you could spare?" Ryokan smiled. "I have just finished my evening meal, but please, take my bowl. Tomorrow, when you reach the village, you can use it to beg for food. It is a good bowl, sturdy and well made. It will serve you better than it serves me." He picked up his wooden bowl, one of his 3 possessions, the bowl that held his food and water, the bowl he had used for years, and handed it to the young man without hesitation, without a single thought of what he would use tomorrow, without any calculation of loss or sacrifice. The young man took the bowl, stunned. "But what will you use?" "The stream has water that can be drunk from cupped hands," Ryokan said. "The earth has leaves that can hold food. I will manage. Go now, before it gets too dark to see the path. Be safe." The young man bowed deeply, tears in his eyes, and disappeared down the mountain path, carrying the bowl and something else. The gift of unexpected generosity, the shock of meeting someone who would give away what little he had without a moment's hesitation. Ryokan sat back down, feeling lighter somehow, even though he now had 1/3 fewer possessions than he'd had 10 minutes ago. 2 things left, the robe on his body and the hut around him. Still more than enough. He was settling into meditation when he heard more footsteps. The second visitor appeared, a woman, middle-aged and weather-worn, wrapped in a thin shawl that did little to keep out the evening chill. She approached the hut and bowed. "Holy One," she said, "I am traveling to visit my sick mother in the next province. My husband died last winter, and I gave all our warm clothes to our children before I left. The nights are getting cold, and I have only this thin shawl. Do you have anything that might help me keep warm on my journey?" Ryokan looked at his robe, simple, patched in places, but warm and whole. It was the only clothing he owned. Without it, he would be naked in the mountain cold. Winter was coming, the nights would grow colder still. He stood and began to remove the robe. "Please," he said, holding it out to her, "take this. It will keep you warmer than that shawl. I am used to the mountain air, and I have the shelter of my hut. You have a long journey ahead. You need this more than I do." The woman's eyes widened. "But you'll have nothing to wear. You'll freeze." "The cold is just cold," Ryokan said, smiling. "It comes and goes like everything else, but you must reach your mother, and she needs you alive and well. Please take it." The woman took the robe with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, to thank him, but words seemed inadequate for what had just happened. This stranger, this hermit with almost nothing, giving her the robe off his own body. She bowed deeply, pressed the robe to her chest, and walked back down the path, looking back several times as if unable to believe what had just occurred. Ryokan stood naked in the evening air. It was cold, yes. Goosebumps rose on his skin. He could feel the temperature dropping as night deepened, but along with the cold, he felt something else, a profound lightness, an opening in his chest, a joy that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the pure act of giving, of holding nothing back, of meeting another person's need with everything he had. One possession left, the hut. He was about to go inside when he heard the third set of footsteps. This visitor was different, an older man, well-dressed despite the dust of travel, with the bearing of a merchant or official. He climbed the last bit of the path and stood before the little bamboo hut, breathing hard from the climb. "Are you the hermit Ryokan?" he asked. "I am called by that name," Ryokan replied, unconscious of his nakedness, as natural as a tree or a stone. The man looked at him with a mixture of shock and fascination. "They say you are a holy man, a wise teacher. I have climbed all this way to ask you a question. But you're naked. Where are your robes?" "I gave them to someone who needed them more," Ryokan said simply. The man blinked, processing this. Then he shook his head as if clearing it, and continued with his purpose. "I have come because I am troubled. I have wealth, more wealth than I know what to do with. I have a large house, servants, storehouses full of goods. But I am not happy. I worry constantly about losing what I have. I trust no one, fearing they want to take from me. I can't sleep well because I'm always thinking about my possessions, protecting them, increasing them. They say you have found peace. Please teach me. How can I be free of this burden? Ryokan laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh that echoed off the mountains. My friend, you have climbed all this way to ask a man with nothing how to be free of having too much. The answer is obvious. Tell me, the man pleaded. Give it away. Give it away? All of it? As much as you need to give to feel light again. Keep enough for simple living, then give the rest to those who need it. You cannot be free while you're clutching your possessions with white knuckles. The tighter you grip, the more imprisoned you become. The man looked troubled. But I worked hard for everything I have. I earned it. And now it owns you, Ryokan said gently. You came up this mountain seeking freedom, but you're carrying your golden chains with you even now, in your mind. I can hear them rattling in your words. The merchant sat down heavily on a rock. I don't know if I can do it. Give it all away. Then don't give it all away, Ryokan said, sitting down beside him, naked as the day he was born, utterly unself-conscious. Start small. Give something to someone who needs it. Notice how it feels. Does your heart get heavier or lighter? Do you feel more imprisoned or more free? Let the giving itself teach you what to do next. They sat together in silence for a while. The wealthy man in his fine clothes and the naked hermit with nothing at all. The contrast would have been comical if it weren't so profound. You really have nothing? The man finally asked. Nothing at all? I have this hut, Ryokan said, gesturing to the small bamboo structure. And the moon, which will rise soon. And the sound of the stream below. And this conversation with you. And the memory of 3 people I was able to help tonight. And the peace of knowing that no one can take from me what I don't have. And the freedom of traveling light through this world. He smiled. Actually, when I count it that way, I have quite a lot. The merchant was quiet, thinking. Then he said, The hut, would you give that away too, if someone needed it? Ryokan considered this. If someone truly needed shelter more than I did, yes. I could sleep under the trees. I have done so before. The stars make a beautiful roof, and the earth is softer than you might think. You're serious. Why would I not be serious? What is this hut but bamboo and thatch? It's useful, but it's not me. I am not diminished by giving it away. Actually, I am enlarged, because in the giving, I touch something bigger than my small self and its small needs. The merchant stood up. I need to think about what you've said. May I come back sometime to speak with you again? Of course. I am usually here, and if I'm not, the mountain is still beautiful. The man bowed and began his descent. He paused after a few steps and turned back. Master Ryokan, please at least take this. He pulled a warm outer robe from his pack and held it out. You'll freeze tonight without clothes. Ryokan smiled but shook his head. Keep it. Give it to someone in the village who needs it. I have given away my robe tonight, and I want to experience what that means, completely. The cold will be my teacher now. I want to learn what it has to show me. The merchant looked at him with something like awe, bowed again, and continued down the path. The warm robe still in his hands, carrying with him a living demonstration of what it means to hold nothing back, to give without calculation, to live in radical freedom from possessions. Ryokan went inside his hut, his one remaining possession. The night was fully dark now and cold. Without his robe, he felt the temperature acutely. He could not sleep yet. His body was too alert, too alive to the chill. So he sat in the doorway of the hut, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening darkness. And then the moon rose full and luminous, climbing above the dark silhouette of the mountains, flooding the world with silver light. Ryokan watched it rise and felt something open in his chest, something vast and wordless. He had given away his bowl, his robe, and tomorrow, if someone came who truly needed it, he would probably give away the hut too. He was down to nothing, or nearly nothing. And yet, looking at that moon, he had never felt richer. The moon cost nothing. It belonged to everyone and no one. It could not be possessed, could not be stored in a warehouse, could not be protected from thieves. It was free, abundant, given equally to the wealthy merchant in his fine house and the naked hermit in his bamboo hut. And in that equality, that abundance, that freely given beauty, there was a teaching more profound than any words. The great hermit poet, whose life Ryokan's echoed, the historical Ryokan who had actually lived this way, had written, "Who says my poems are poems? My poems are not poems. When you understand that my poems are not poems, then we can speak of poetry." Sitting there under the full moon, naked and cold and possessing almost nothing, Ryokan understood. Who says wealth is wealth? When you understand that possessions are not wealth, then we can speak of true richness, the richness of moonlight that cannot be owned, the richness of giving that enlarges rather than diminishes, the richness of having nothing that makes you free to have everything. He began to laugh, a deep belly laugh that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through his body and spilling out into the night. He laughed at the absurdity of it, at the perfection of it, at the way the universe had conspired to leave him with nothing and everything at the same time. And as he laughed, sitting naked in the doorway of his tiny hut, the moon seemed to laugh with him, pouring its silver light over the mountains, over the village below, over the three travelers making their way through the night carrying what he had given them, over the whole beautiful, impermanent, generous world. "Look," he said to the moon, as if it were an old friend, "I wanted to give you to those travelers too, but you were not mine to give. You gave yourself, as you always do, freely to everyone. That's the teaching, isn't it? Be like the moon, abundant, generous, belonging to no one, available to all." The moon made no answer, but its light seemed to intensify, and Ryokan felt it as a confirmation, a blessing, a silent teaching that needed no words. He would be cold tonight. Tomorrow he would have to beg for food and eat it from his cupped hands or from leaves. He had no security, no comfort, no possessions to fall back on, and yet he had everything that mattered: the freedom to give, the joy of generosity, the lightness of traveling through life unburdened, and this moon, this magnificent moon that shone on him as it had shone on 10,000 generations of humans and would shine on 10,000 more, asking nothing, giving everything, teaching by example what it means to be truly rich. The hermit smiled at the moon, and the moon smiled back, much like a mirror that held the most profound lesson a vain emperor would ever receive, reflecting not what he wanted to see, but what he needed to understand. When the emperor finally looked past his reflection, he saw the sky. But let me take you back to the palace first, to the elaborate throne room where Emperor Takamori sat surrounded by luxury beyond measure, commanding armies and provinces, wielding power over millions of lives, and yet utterly impure, eisened by what he saw in his mirror each morning. Emperor Takamori was not an evil man. He had not seized his throne through cruelty or maintained it through tyranny. He was, by most accounts, a fair ruler who listened to his advisors, cared about his people's welfare, and governed with reasonable wisdom. But he had one consuming weakness, one obsession that grew stronger with each passing year: his appearance, his image, his reflection, the face he presented to the world. He owned 73 mirrors, positioned throughout the palace so that he could check his appearance at any moment. Mirrors in every room, mirrors at every turn, mirrors that reflected him from every angle. He employed a staff of attendants whose sole purpose was to maintain his appearance, combing his hair, adjusting his robes, ensuring that every fold fell perfectly, that every ornament sat at precisely the right angle, that his face was powdered to hide any imperfection. He could not pass a reflective surface without stopping to examine himself. A polished bronze shield, a still pond, a servant's polished tray, anything that showed his image would capture his attention. He would pause, adjust, examine, worry. Was his hair graying at the temples? Were those lines deepening around his eyes? Did his chin look weaker from this angle? Did he appear as powerful, as commanding, as worthy of the throne as an emperor should? The obsession had grown worse over the years. When he was young, he had been confident in his appearance, secure in his strength and vitality. But now, at 50 years old, he saw the creeping signs of age in every reflection, and each sign felt like a small death, a loss of something essential to who he was. His identity had become so entangled with his appearance that every wrinkle felt like a diminishment of his very self. His advisors worried about him. His wife rarely saw him, as he spent hours each day in his private chambers, examining himself in different lights, from different angles, consulting with physicians about treatments to preserve his youthful appearance. Affairs of state sometimes went unattended because the emperor was too distressed about a new grey hair or a slight puffiness under his eyes to focus on governance. One day, a renowned master craftsman came to the palace. His name was Kenzo, and he was famous throughout the land for creating the finest mirrors ever made. Mirrors so perfectly polished, so precisely curved, that they showed reflections clearer than reality itself. The emperor had summoned him with a command: create the most perfect mirror ever made, a mirror worthy of an emperor, a mirror that would show him as he truly was. Kenzo bowed low and accepted the commission. He was given access to the palace workshops, provided with the finest materials, and given 3 months to complete his work. The emperor waited impatiently, certain that this perfect mirror would somehow solve the problem of his reflection, would show him the image he wanted to see, rather than the aging face that caused him such distress. The 3 months passed. Finally, Kenzo requested an audience. He came to the throne room carrying a large object wrapped in silk. The emperor dismissed everyone except his most trusted advisor, eager to see this perfect mirror in private, away from eyes that might judge his vanity. Kenzo unwrapped the mirror with ceremony, and the emperor gasped. It was indeed the finest mirror he had ever seen, the bronze polished to an impossible sheen, the surface perfectly flat, the frame elaborately decorated with dragons and phoenixes. He approached it eagerly, ready to see his reflection rendered with unprecedented clarity. But when he looked into the mirror, his face fell. There he was, Emperor Takamori, at 50 years old, with grey in his hair and lines on his face and the soft jaw of middle age. The mirror was so perfect that it hid nothing, showed every flaw with merciless precision. It was exactly what he had asked for, and exactly what he had hoped to avoid. "This is terrible," he exclaimed. "This mirror shows me as old, as worn, as diminished. I asked for a perfect mirror, and you have created something that mocks me with my own aging." Kenzo bowed. "My Lord Emperor requested a mirror that would show him as he truly is. This mirror shows exactly that." "But I look old." "You are 50 years old, my lord." "The mirror shows the truth." The emperor turned away from the mirror in disgust. For days afterward, he refused to look at it. Had it covered with silk? Considered having it destroyed. But something about Kenzo's words stayed with him. The mirror shows the truth. Was he angry at the mirror, or at the truth it showed? Word of the emperor's distress reached the ears of a wandering Zen master named Hakuin, not the famous historical Hakuin, but one of his later disciples who carried the same name and teaching. This master had not been invited to the palace, had no official business there, but somehow, in the way that Zen masters sometimes appear exactly when needed, he arrived at the palace gates and requested an audience. Perhaps because the emperor was desperate. Perhaps because his advisor thought this master might help, Hakuin was granted entry. He came to the throne room where the emperor sat brooding, the covered mirror standing against the wall like an accusation. "Majesty," Hakuin said with a bow, "I have heard you are troubled by a mirror." "I am troubled by age, by decline, by the loss of what I was," the emperor said bitterly. "The mirror merely shows it." "May I see this troubling mirror?" Hakuin asked. The emperor gestured, and servants removed the silk covering. Hakuin examined the mirror with interest, walking around it, looking at it from different angles. Then he smiled. "This is indeed a perfect mirror," he said, "perhaps too perfect for most purposes. But I have brought you another mirror, one that might serve you better." From his simple bag, he withdrew a plain wooden bowl and filled it with water from a pitcher on a nearby table. A bowl of water, the emperor said, confused and somewhat insulted. A different kind of mirror, Hakuin replied. Please, look into it. The emperor approached the bowl reluctantly. He looked down at the water's surface and saw his reflection there, but it was different from the bronze mirror's reflection. It was softer, wavering slightly, less distinct, and beyond his reflection he could see the wooden bottom of the bowl, and tiny ripples disturbing the surface from the water's own movement. What am I supposed to see? The emperor asked impatiently. What do you see? Hakuin countered. I see myself, and the bowl, and the water moving. Look longer, Hakuin suggested. Look past your reflection. The emperor looked again, trying to understand what the master wanted from him. As he stared at the water, he began to notice things he had not noticed before. The way his reflection was constantly changing as tiny ripples moved across the surface. The way it disappeared entirely when the water was disturbed. The way it was only a reflection of light, not a solid thing at all. My reflection keeps changing, he observed. It's not stable. Yes, Hakuin said. Now, tell me which is more true. The perfect bronze mirror that shows every detail frozen in a moment, or this water that shows you constantly changing, constantly in motion, never the same from one instant to the next? The emperor frowned, thinking. Both are true, I suppose, but the bronze mirror seems more real, more solid. Does it? Hakuin asked. He reached out and dropped a single pebble into the bowl of water. The emperor's reflection shattered into ripples, disappeared completely, and then slowly reformed as the water settled but slightly different, never exactly the same as before. The great teacher Senkan wrote, Hakuin said, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. Your suffering, Majesty, comes not from your aging face, but from your preference for a different face. You want to look young, so you suffer when you look old. You want to look strong, so you suffer when you see weakness. You want to look perfect, so you suffer when you see flaws. The mirror shows only what is. The suffering comes from wanting what is to be different. The emperor stared at the rippling water, watching his reflection reform and change. But how can I not prefer youth to age, strength to weakness, beauty to decay? You can prefer whatever you wish, Hakuin said gently. But when you make your sense of self dependent on that preference, you trap yourself in endless suffering. You are not your reflection, Majesty. You are not your face, not your body, not your appearance. These things change constantly, as the water shows you. They have always been changing, since the moment you were born. What you see as loss is simply the nature of all conditioned things. He gestured to the bronze mirror. This perfect mirror shows you a frozen moment, and you compare it to memory, to what you looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And you suffer from the comparison. But if you could see yourself as this water shows you constantly changing, never fixed, always flowing, you might find freedom from that suffering. The emperor sat down, feeling suddenly tired. I have built my entire identity on my appearance. I have believed that my worth, my power, my very self were tied to how I looked. If I'm not that reflection, then who am I? Ah, Hakuin said, his eyes brightening. Now you're asking the right question, not, how do I look? But, who am I? Tell me, Majesty, when you were born, did you have an identity based on your appearance? No, I suppose not. I was just a baby. And when you die, will your appearance matter? No. So, for a brief span between birth and death, you have convinced yourself that you are this reflection in the mirror. But before your appearance, you existed. And after your appearance fades, you will still exist in some form in memory, in the effects of your actions, in the ripples you have sent out into the world. So the reflection is temporary, but something else continues. What is that something? The emperor had no answer. He looked at the water bowl, at his wavering reflection, and then following some instinct he didn't understand, he looked past the reflection to the bottom of the bowl, to the wood beneath the water. And as he looked past his own image, he saw the bowl itself, solid and simple. And past the bowl, he saw the table. And past the table, he saw the floor. And lifting his eyes, he saw the ceiling with its elaborate paintings of clouds and sky. "I see the painted sky," he said, surprised at where his gaze had travelled. "Yes," Hakuin said softly. "When you look past your reflection, you see the sky. When you stop being trapped by your image, you see the larger world. Your reflection has been blocking your view all along." The emperor stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the palace gardens stretched in their autumn beauty. Red maples, golden ginkgos, the last chrysanthemums blooming. The sky above was clear and vast. All of this had been there every day, but he had barely seen it. So consumed had he been with checking his reflection, worrying about his appearance, trying to hold on to a youth that was naturally, inevitably, flowing away like water. "The Buddha taught," Hakuin continued, "that in whom there is no sympathy for living beings, know him as an outcast. Majesty, you have been cast out from life itself, not by others, but by your own obsession with your reflection. While you worried about your wrinkles, your people lived and died. While you examined your grey hairs, the seasons changed. While you mourned your aging face, beauty bloomed all around you unnoticed." The words struck deep. The emperor realized with sudden clarity how much he had missed, how absent he had been from his own life, how his obsession with appearance had made him a ghost haunting his own palace, seeing only himself repeated in endless mirrors, never truly seeing anything else. "What should I do?" he asked quietly. "Perhaps," Hakuin suggested, "you might begin by putting away most of your mirrors. Keep one, if you must, for practical purposes. But 73 mirrors means 73 opportunities each day to be trapped by your reflection. Reduce the opportunities. See how it feels to walk through your palace without constantly checking your appearance. And then practice looking at other things. The gardens you have neglected to see. The faces of your advisors, your servants, your wife, really looking at them with interest in who they are, rather than concern for who you are. The sky, the clouds, the trees, the ordinary miracles happening all around you while you stare at your own image." The emperor nodded slowly. It would not be easy. Decades of habit, of identity built on appearance, could not be undone in a moment. But he could begin. "Master Hakuin," he said, "will you stay at the palace for a time? Continue to teach me." Hakuin shook his head. "I think you need no more teaching, Majesty. You need only to practice what you already understand. But I will leave you with a practice. Each day, spend time with the water bowl instead of the bronze mirror. Watch your reflection in the water. See how it changes, how it's never fixed, how it disappears with the smallest disturbance. Let it teach you about impermanence, about the nature of all forms. And then look past it, see what else is there." The master bowed and departed, leaving the emperor alone with his two mirrors, the perfect bronze that showed frozen details and the simple water bowl that showed flowing change. In the days that followed, the emperor began his practice. He had most of the mirrors removed from the palace, keeping only a few for practical use. He spent time each morning with the water bowl, watching his reflection form and dissolve, change and flow. And slowly, painfully, he began to loosen his grip on the identity he had built around his appearance. He began to notice other things. The way morning light slanted through the palace windows, the expression on his wife's face when he actually looked at her with attention instead of hurrying past to check his reflection, the changing seasons in the garden, the concerns of his advisors, which he could finally hear because he wasn't distracted by worry about how he looked while hearing them. He was still aging. The wrinkles still deepened, the grey hair still spread, but these changes began to feel less like catastrophes and more like what they actually were, the natural progression of a life being lived, of time passing, of the inevitable flow that carries all beings from birth toward death. One day, several months after Hakuin's visit, the emperor sat by the water bowl as dawn broke. He looked at his reflection and saw a man of 50+ years, lined and greying and no longer young. And for the first time he felt no pain at the sight. It was simply what was, a reflection of a particular moment in a constantly changing flow. Then he looked past the reflection as Hakuin had taught him. He saw through the water to the bowl, past the bowl to the table, beyond the table to the window, and through the window to the sky, where the first light of dawn was painting clouds in shades of rose and gold. And in that moment of looking past himself, he experienced something he had not felt in years: genuine joy. Not the fragile pleasure of seeing a favorable reflection, but the deep joy of being present to the world, of seeing beauty that had nothing to do with him, of participating in something larger than his small, changing, impermanent self. The emperor smiled, not at his reflection but at the sky, at the dawn, at the simple fact of being alive in this moment, this unrepeatable, precious moment that existed independent of how he looked, how he appeared, how others might judge his aging face. When the emperor finally looked past his reflection, he saw the sky. And this brings me to a potter who understood the beauty of imperfection better than anyone, who was about to discover that sometimes broken things become more beautiful precisely because they've been broken. That golden light through the crack showed her what words often cannot. But let me take you to the workshop first, to a small pottery studio in a quiet village where a master potter named Hannah had spent 30 years perfecting her craft, creating pieces of such flawless beauty that collectors travel from distant provinces to acquire her work. Hannah's pottery was renowned for its perfection. Her bowls were perfectly round, their walls uniform in thickness, their glazes applied with such precision that they showed no variations, no irregularities, no accidents of the kiln. Her vases stood perfectly straight, their proportions mathematically ideal, their surfaces smooth as silk. Her teacups nested one inside another, with such exactness that you could barely see the seams between them. She had spent decades learning to eliminate every flaw, to control every variable, to master the clay so completely that it submitted to her vision without resistance. Every piece she created was a testament to her skill, her discipline, her refusal to accept anything less than perfection. And she took pride in this, the pride of a craftsman who has achieved mastery, who can look at her work and see no mistakes, no weaknesses, no traces of the human hand that might have faltered. But perfection, she was about to discover, can be its own kind of prison. The bowl she was working on this autumn morning was perhaps the finest piece she had ever created. She had been planning it for months, gathering the perfect clay, mixing the perfect glaze, a deep blue called Sky After Rain, that took weeks to prepare properly. The form was to be simple, a tea bowl, modest in size but perfect in proportion, a piece that would be used in formal tea ceremony, where every detail mattered, where imperfection was unacceptable. She had thrown the bowl on her wheel 2 weeks ago, centering the clay with absolute precision, pulling the walls up with hands that knew exactly how thin to make them, how wide to shape the rim, how deep to form the curve. The form had been perfect. She had let it dry to leather hard, then trimmed the foot with meticulous care, creating a ring that was exactly even, exactly the right height, exactly balanced. Then the first firing, the bisque firing to harden the clay. Perfect. No cracks, no warping, no accidents. Then the glazing, 3 careful layers of the Sky After Rain blue, applied with a brush that left no marks, no drips, no irregularities. And finally, the last firing, the high-temperature firing that would melt the glaze into glass and seal the piece forever. She had opened the kiln that morning with anticipation. The firing had gone well. She could tell by the color of the cooling kiln, by the way the temperature had held steady through the crucial hours. She waited for the kiln to cool enough to open it safely, her heart beating with the excitement that even 30 years of pottery making had not diminished. This bowl was going to be her masterpiece. She could feel it. Perfect form, perfect glaze, perfect execution. The culmination of everything she had learned. She opened the kiln. The bowl sat on its shelf, glowing with the deep blue of Sky After Rain. She reached in carefully with her tongs, lifted it, brought it out into the morning light, and gasped. The bowl was perfect almost. The form was flawless. The glaze was exquisite. But there, running from the rim down to the base, was a crack. Not a huge crack, not a break that split the bowl in two, but a definite crack, a line that caught the light, a flaw that destroyed the perfection she had worked so hard to achieve. Her hands began to shake. How had this happened? She had been so careful, so precise. She had controlled every variable she could control, and yet the bowl had cracked. Probably in the cooling process, probably from some stress in the clay she had not detected. Some invisible weakness that had chosen this moment, this bowl, this masterpiece to reveal itself. She carried the bowl to her work table and set it down, staring at it with a mixture of disbelief and despair. Months of planning, weeks of work, the finest clay, the most carefully prepared glaze, every technique applied with the precision of 3 decades of experience. And it was ruined by a crack. Her first impulse was to smash it, to destroy this mocking reminder of how even mastery cannot guarantee perfection, how even the most careful control cannot prevent the accidents that clay and fire and physics conspire to create. Her hand reached for a hammer that lay nearby, but before she could lift it, she heard a voice behind her. "That is a beautiful bowl." She turned to find a monk standing in the doorway of her studio. He was elderly, with a weathered face and simple robes, and he carried a walking staff that suggested he had traveled far. She didn't recognize him, didn't know how he had entered her studio, didn't particularly care in this moment of distress. "It's ruined," she said flatly. "There's a crack." The monk approached the table and looked at the bowl with genuine interest. He was silent for a long moment, examining it from different angles, and then he did something unexpected. He filled the bowl with water from a pitcher on the work table. "What are you doing?" Hannah asked, alarmed. "The crack, it will leak." But the bowl held water. The crack was apparently not deep enough to penetrate through the wall. The monk positioned the bowl so that the morning light coming through the window struck it at an angle, and suddenly Hannah saw what he was seeing. The crack caught the light, not just caught it, transformed it. The light entered the crack and scattered, creating a line of illumination that ran down the bowl like lightning frozen in blue sky, like a river of light flowing through the glaze. The crack made the light visible in a way that the perfect surface could not. It broke up the uniformity, created movement, drew the eye along a journey from rim to base. The bowl was no longer just perfect. It was alive. "In Japan," the monk said quietly, "there is a practice called kintsugi. When a precious bowl breaks, craftsmen repair it with lacquer mixed with gold. They don't hide the cracks, they highlight them, make them visible, transform the break into a kind of beauty that the original bowl did not possess. The philosophy is that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken." Hannah stared at the bowl, at the crack now illuminated by light and water, and felt something crack inside herself as well. Some rigid belief about perfection, some tightly held conviction that only the flawless had value. "But I worked so hard to make it perfect," she whispered. "I spent my whole life learning to eliminate flaws." "And you succeeded remarkably," the monk said. "This bowl shows incredible skill. But perhaps perfection is not the highest achievement. Perhaps there is something beyond perfection." "What could be beyond perfection?" The monk smiled. "Wholeness, authenticity, truth. This bowl is now more true than a perfect bowl could be. It tells a story of creation and stress, of cooling and cracking, of the fire's effect on clay, of the unpredictability of the process. A perfect bowl tells no story except the story of human control. This bowl tells the story of what happens when we work with the world rather than trying to dominate it." Hannah sat down heavily on her work stool. She thought of all her perfect pieces, lined up in her studio, waiting to be sold to collectors. They were beautiful, yes. Skillful, yes. But were they alive? Did they have the quality this cracked bowl suddenly possessed, the sense of having been through something, of bearing witness to the transformation that fire works on earth? "The great tea master Sen no Rikyu," the monk continued, "taught that we should see beauty in imperfection. This is the principle of wabi-sabi, finding the profound in the imperfect, the impermanent, the incomplete. Your perfect bowls are impressive, but this bowl, with its crack-catching light, this bowl has wabi-sabi, it has depth, it has survived fire and emerged bearing the marks of that survival. He paused, then quoted, "The Buddha taught that everything is based on mind, is led by mind, is fashioned by mind. You fashioned this bowl with a mind seeking perfection, but the fire fashioned it with a different mind, the mind of transformation, of change, of the natural processes that don't seek perfection but simply express what is. And together, you and the fire created something neither of you could have created alone." Hannah picked up the bowl, cradling it in her hands. The crack ran like a river through the blue glaze, and where the morning light touched it, it glowed. She tilted the bowl, watching how the light moved along the crack, how it created patterns that shifted with every slight change of angle. "I was going to destroy it," she said. "I was reaching for a hammer when you arrived." "I know," the monk said. "I could see it in your face, and if you had destroyed it, you would have destroyed not just the bowl, but also the teaching it carries. Sometimes our greatest teachers are the things that refuse to be what we demand they be." Over the following days, Hannah could not stop thinking about the cracked bowl. She set it in different places in her studio, watched how light interacted with it at different times of day. The crack never looked the same twice. In morning light, it glowed with gold tones. In afternoon light, it darkened to indigo. In evening light, it seemed to pulse with its own inner illumination. And as she looked at the bowl, she began to look differently at her other work. Her perfect pieces suddenly seemed cold, distant, untouched by the fire that had created them. They showed her skill, but not the process. They demonstrated her control, but not the collaboration between potter and clay, between human intention and material reality. She began experimenting. She made a new bowl and deliberately left a thumbprint in the clay, just a small one, barely visible, but there, a mark of her hand, her presence, her humanity. She made another bowl and allowed the glaze to pool thicker in one area, creating a variation in color that her old perfectionist self would have rejected. She made a vase and left the throwing lines visible, showing how the clay had spiraled upward under her fingers. Each imperfection felt like a small rebellion, a step away from the tyranny of perfection towards something more alive, more honest, more real. Word spread through the village about Hannah's cracked bowl. People asked to see it. Some collectors who had purchased her perfect pieces came to her studio curious about this new development in her work. And when they saw the bowl, many of them understood immediately what the monk had helped her see. "Your other pieces are beautiful," one collector said, "but they could have been made by anyone with sufficient skill. This could only have been made by you, working with this particular clay, in this particular firing, on this particular day. It's unique. It's alive." Not everyone understood. Some collectors wanted only perfection and turned away disappointed. But others, those with eyes to see, recognized something precious in the cracked bowl and in the new work Hannah was beginning to create. One afternoon, several weeks after the monk's visit, a young potter came to Hannah's studio asking to apprentice with her. "I want to learn your technique," the young woman said, "the way you create such perfect pieces." Hannah smiled and picked up the cracked bowl. "One can teach you the techniques I know," she said. "But what I hope to teach you is something more important, how to work with imperfection rather than against it. How to see beauty in what's broken, how to let the fire and the clay teach you rather than forcing them to obey you." The young potter looked confused. "But your perfect pieces are what made you famous. Why would you teach imperfection?" "Because I spent 30 years pursuing perfection, and it made me skillful but not wise. This crack," she traced the line with her finger, "taught me more in one moment than 3 decades of perfect bowls. It taught me that trying to control everything, to eliminate every flaw, to achieve absolute perfection, is actually a form of violence against the natural world. Clay wants to be clay. Fire wants to be fire. They will do what they do, and we can work with them or fight them. I fought them for 30 years. Now I want to learn to dance with them instead." She began teaching the young potter, but her teaching was different now. Instead of emphasizing control and precision above all else, she taught sensitivity to the clay's nature, responsiveness to what the fire revealed, appreciation for the accidents that carried their own wisdom. She taught that a crack is not a failure, but a conversation between clay and fire, and that sometimes the conversation produces something more interesting than what the potter intended. Months later, on the first anniversary of the cracked bowl's creation, Hannah held a small tea ceremony in her studio. She used the cracked bowl to serve tea to a few close friends, including the young potter who was now her student, and including unexpectedly the old monk who had appeared in her doorway that morning and changed everything with a few words and a bowl of water. As they drank tea, the late autumn light slanted through the window and struck the bowl at precisely the right angle. The crack blazed with golden light as if fire still lived inside the clay, as if the bowl was being transformed again in this moment. Master Rikyū taught, the monk said, breaking the contemplative silence, that in tea ceremony we appreciate the beauty of imperfection because it reminds us of the impermanence of all things. This bowl, with its crack, embodies that teaching. It is beautiful not despite being broken, but because it has been broken and survived, like all of us. Hannah bowed to him. Thank you, teacher, for helping me see what I had been too blind to notice, that perfection is the enemy of life, and that the cracks are where the light enters. The monk smiled. I taught you nothing. The bowl taught you one only pointed. That evening, after everyone had left, Hannah sat alone with the cracked bowl. She ran her finger along the crack, feeling its slight indentation, its texture different from the smooth glaze around it. Tomorrow she would begin a new piece, not trying to recreate the accident of the crack, but trying to work with the same openness to what wanted to emerge, the same willingness to accept what the fire revealed, the same trust in the process rather than the plan. She had spent 30 years learning control. Now she would spend the rest of her life learning to let go, to collaborate, to see the beauty in what broke and how it broke, and what the breaking revealed. The bowl sat on her work table, the crack catching the last light of day, glowing like a river of gold through blue sky, teaching its silent lesson about brokenness and beauty, about perfection and truth, about the light that can only enter through the cracks we tried so hard to prevent. That golden light through the crack showed her what words often cannot. Though one master tried to teach this very thing through silence itself, through a gesture so simple it contained everything, through a teaching beyond all teachings. The master's final teaching was approaching, but let me take you to the beginning of that extraordinary day, to a monastery where hundreds of students had gathered from across the land, knowing that the elderly master they revered was preparing to give his last formal teaching before entering Kumple, to silence and retreat, preparing for the journey from which no traveler returns. Master Shuzan was 93 years old, and he had been teaching for nearly 70 years. Thousands of students had passed through his meditation hall. Countless seekers had asked him questions about enlightenment, about suffering, about the nature of reality and the path to liberation. He had given hundreds of Dharma talks, conducted thousands of interviews, responded to endless koans with the sharp clarity that had made him legendary. His words were recorded in scrolls that students copied and studied. His commentaries on ancient texts were considered profound and illuminating. His explanations of difficult concepts were praised for their precision and depth. If wisdom could be measured in words spoken and teachings given, Master Shuzan would be among the wisest teachers who had ever lived. But now he was old, his body worn by 9 decades of life, his voice grown soft, his movements slow and deliberate. He had announced that on this autumn day, the 15th day of the 9th month, he would give one final teaching to all his students before withdrawing into silence. And so they came. The monks who lived at the monastery, the students from neighboring temples, the lay people who had studied with him over the years, all gathering in the great hall to hear what final wisdom this ancient master would share. The hall was packed. Students sat in tight rows, some having arrived days early to ensure a place near the front. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and solemnity. What would the master say? What profound teaching would he leave them with? What secret would he finally reveal, now that he was approaching the end of his teaching career? Among the hundreds gathered was a young monk named Mahakachapa, not the historical disciple of the Buddha who bore that name, but a modern student whose parents had named him in honor of that ancient awakened one. This Mahakaccapa had been studying with Master Shuzan for 5 years. He had meditated countless hours, studied all the texts, memorized sutras, wrestled with koans, and yet enlightenment remained elusive. He was certain that today's teaching would be the key, the final piece that would unlock everything. Next to him sat an older nun named Enso, who had been with the master for 30 years. She had heard thousands of his teachings, had private interviews with him countless times, and had achieved a reputation for deep practice and clarity of insight. Yet even she had come to hear this final teaching, curious what the master would say when words were about to end forever. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of the hall, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the still air. The assembly grew quiet as Master Shuzan's attendant helped him to the raised platform at the front of the hall. The master moved slowly, each step deliberate, his body bent with age, but his eyes still bright and alert. He settled onto his cushion with care, arranging his robes, taking his time. The silence deepened, hundreds of people barely breathing, every attention focused on this frail old man who was about to speak. The young Mahakaccapa leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single word. Master Shuzan looked out at the assembly. His gaze moved slowly across the rows of students, seeming to see each person individually, acknowledging each presence. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The students waited, patient, knowing that the master always began his talks with a period of silence to help everyone settle. 3 minutes. 4 minutes. Some students shifted slightly, wondering when he would begin. The young Mahakaccapa felt a flutter of anxiety. Was something wrong? Was the master ill? Should his attendant help him? 5 minutes. 6 minutes. The silence was becoming palpable now, a presence in itself. The nun Enso had closed her eyes, settled into the silence as if into meditation, but many other students were beginning to look confused, uncertain. Then Master Shuzan reached into his robe and withdrew something. The students craned their necks to see. It was a flower, a single white chrysanthemum, perfect and simple, its petals just beginning to open. The master held up the flower. That was all. He simply held it up, his thin arm extended, the white flower bright in the morning light streaming through the windows. He held it steadily, his eyes looking at it, his face composed and peaceful. The students waited. Surely this was a prelude to the teaching. Surely he would now explain the significance of the flower, would launch into a Dharma talk about impermanence or Buddha nature, or the relationship between form and emptiness, using the flower as an illustration. But the master said nothing. He simply held the flower, looking at it with complete attention, as if nothing else existed in the world but this one white chrysanthemum. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes. The confusion in the hall grew more pronounced. Students exchanged glances. Was this a test? A koan? What did the flower mean? What was the master trying to teach? Young Mahakaccapa felt frustration rising. He had come to hear wisdom, to receive teachings, to finally understand what had eluded him for 5 years of intense practice. And the master was just holding a flower? What kind of teaching was this? What was he supposed to learn from watching an old man hold a flower in silence? His mind raced through possibilities. The flower represented impermanence. It would wilt and die. The flower represented Buddha nature, pure and perfect. The flower represented the present moment, here, now, complete in itself. The flower represented emptiness. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Which was it? What was the right answer? The nun Enso opened her eyes and looked at the flower. Her face was calm, receptive, without the strain of trying to figure anything out. She simply looked, the way one looks at a sunset or a mountain or anything beautiful, with open attention, without commentary, without the need to understand or interpret. 5 minutes passed with the master holding the flower. 10 minutes. 15. Some students were becoming restless now. This was supposed to be a teaching, not a silent meditation session. Some looked annoyed, some looked bored, some looked desperate, trying harder and harder to decode what the flower meant. what secret teaching it contained, what the master was trying to communicate through this strange gesture. And then something happened. The nun, Enso, smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic reaction, just a soft, gentle smile that spread across her face like dawn breaking, like understanding blooming, like coming home after a long journey. She saw the flower, really saw it, and in that seeing, she saw everything. Not with her thinking mind, not with her analytical understanding, not with her knowledge of Buddhist philosophy or her years of study. She saw with direct perception, with the eye that sees before thought divides the world into seer and seen, subject and object, teacher and student. Master Shuzan saw her smile, and he smiled back the same gentle smile, the smile of recognition, of confirmation, of two people meeting in a place beyond words where the truth lives that cannot be spoken but can be directly transmitted from heart to heart. The moment hung in the air like the flower itself, perfect, complete, inexplicable. Then the master slowly lowered the flower. He placed it gently on the platform beside him. He looked out at the assembly one more time, his eyes soft with compassion for all these students who had come seeking words, seeking explanations, seeking teachings that would give them what they already had but couldn't recognize. He brought his palms together in Gasho, bowed to the assembly, and slowly with his attendants' help rose and left the hall. That was the teaching, the entire teaching. A flower held up in silence, one student's smile of recognition and a silent departure. The hall erupted in confused murmuring. Students turned to each other, asking what had just happened. What did it mean? What were they supposed to have learned? Was that really all? Had the master grown senile, forgotten to actually teach? The young Mahakachapa felt cheated, angry even. He had waited for this teaching, anticipated it, and all he got was an old man holding a flower and then leaving? Where was the wisdom? Where were the profound explanations? Where was the teaching that would finally unlock enlightenment for him? But the nun Enso sat in perfect stillness, her eyes closed now, that gentle smile still on her face. And around her, a few other students, not many, perhaps a dozen out of the hundreds present, sat with similar expressions of quiet joy, of recognition, of having received something precious that needed no words. After the assembly dispersed, Mahakasyapa approached Enso in the garden. "You smiled," he said, unable to keep the frustration from his voice. "You understood something. Please tell me, what did the master teach? What did the flower mean?" Enso looked at him with kindness. "The master taught nothing." "But you smiled. You understood something." "I understood that there was nothing to understand." Mahakachapa felt his frustration deepen. "That makes no sense. You're speaking in riddles like all the old students. Why can't anyone just explain plainly what the teaching was?" Enso gestured to a chrysanthemum blooming in the garden white, like the one the master had held. "What does this flower teach?" she asked. "I don't know. Impermanence? Buddha nature? Emptiness?" "It teaches nothing," Enso said. "It's just a flower. It blooms because that's what flowers do. It's completely itself, completely present, not trying to teach anyone anything." And the master was showing us exactly that, not explaining it, not talking about it, but showing it, being it. "But the Buddha taught for 45 years, Mahakachapa protested. "The Dharma is full of teachings, explanations, methods. How can the final teaching be silence?" "The Buddha taught because people asked," Enso said. "He gave methods because people needed methods. He explained because people needed explanations. But he also said," the Buddha himself said this, "that the Dharma is beyond words and concepts, beyond anything that can be spoken or taught. Words point to the truth, but they are not the truth. The flower was not pointing to anything. The flower was truth itself, complete and perfect, needing no explanation." She paused, looking at the young monk with compassion. "For 5 years, you've been studying words, analyzing teachings, trying to understand your way to enlightenment, and all those words have been pointing at something, at this, at the direct experience of reality as it is, without the filter of concepts and explanations. The master held up the flower to show you what all the words had been pointing at, not to give you something new to think about, but to invite you to stop thinking and simply see. But I looked at the flower, Mahakachapa said. I saw it. Did you? Or were you too busy trying to figure out what it meant, what teaching it contained, what you were supposed to understand? Were you actually present with the flower, or were you lost in your head, trying to decode a message? The words struck home. Mahakachapa realized with sudden clarity that he had barely seen the flower at all. He had been so busy trying to interpret it, so consumed with figuring out the teaching, that the actual flower, the white petals, the delicate stem, the particular quality of its presence, had been invisible to him. He had been looking at his thoughts about the flower rather than at the flower itself. The teaching that needs no words, and so continued, is the teaching of direct transmission. Not transmission of information or concepts, but transmission of seeing, of being, of recognizing what you already are. When I saw the flower, I wasn't thinking about Buddha nature or impermanence or any concept. I was simply present with the flower, and in that presence there was no separation between seer and seen, no gap between subject and object, no distance between this moment and eternity. And the master saw that I had received the transmission, so he smiled. Not because I had figured out the right answer, but because I had stopped trying to figure anything out and had simply been present. Mahakachapa sat down on a stone bench, feeling something shifting in him. The historical Mahakachapa, the one I'm named after, he was the one who smiled when the Buddha held up the flower, wasn't he, in the famous story? Yes, Enso said. And the Buddha said, I have the treasure of the true Dharma I, the marvelous mind of Nirvana, the true form of no form, the subtle Dharma gate. It does not depend on words and is transmitted outside the teachings. I entrust it to Mahakachapa. That story is the founding moment of Zen, the recognition that the deepest truth cannot be spoken, but can be directly transmitted from awakened heart to awakened heart. But I'm not awakened, Mahakachapa said quietly. Are you sure? Enso asked. Or have you just been so busy looking for awakening, trying to achieve it, studying how to get it, that you haven't noticed it's already here, already what you are, already complete? The Buddha also taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. You keep seeking peace in teachings, in understanding, in explanations. But peace is not in the words. Peace is what remains when you stop seeking, when you stop trying to understand, when you simply are. They sat together in silence, watching the chrysanthemums bloom in the garden. After a long while, Mahakachapa noticed something. He was looking at a flower, really looking at it, not thinking about it, not trying to understand it, not analyzing what it meant or what teaching it contained, just seeing it, the way you might see the face of someone you love, with direct perception unmediated by thought. And in that seeing, something opened, not dramatically, not with lightning and thunder, but quietly, like a flower opening at its own pace. He saw the flower, and the flower was just itself, complete and perfect, not lacking anything, not needing to be interpreted or understood. And he was just himself, seeing the flower, and there was no problem, no seeking, no gap between what is and what should be. A small smile touched his lips. Enso saw it and smiled back the same smile she had given the master, the smile of recognition, of welcome, of coming home to what had always been here. Now you've received the teaching, she said softly. But he didn't teach anything, Mahakachapa said. Exactly, Enso replied. And they sat together in the garden, among the blooming chrysanthemums, in the silence that holds all teachings and needs none, in the presence that is complete before any words arise and remains complete after all words fall away, in the peace that the Buddha spoke of, the peace that comes from within, that does not depend on understanding or achievement or awakening, but simply is, has always been, will always be, waiting patiently for us to stop seeking it long enough to recognize what we already are. That evening, Master Shuzan entered his final retreat. He would speak no more words for the remaining months of his life. But he had given his greatest teaching not through the thousands of Dharma talks he had delivered over 7 decades, not through his profound explanations and careful instructions, but through a single flower held up in silence and the smile that passed between him and a student who finally saw tea. All the words had been pointing toward all along, the teaching beyond words, the truth that cannot be spoken but can be directly known. The transmission from heart to heart that needs no scriptures, no explanations, no concepts, no understanding, only presence, only seeing, only the simple recognition of what is as it is, complete in this moment, lacking nothing, perfect in its imperfection, whole in its brokenness, found only when we stop seeking and finally, simply are. And so, like that student who smiled at the flower, perhaps you too have glimpsed what these 12 stories have been gently pointing toward all along. Not something to achieve or acquire, but something to remember, to recognize, to rest into. The monk's stones, the tea master's cup, the garden's weeds, the woodcutter's presence, the ferryman's calm, the river's crossing, the student's sudden knowing, the woman's open hands, the hermit's wealth, the emperor's true face, the potter's broken beauty, and the master's wordless wisdom, all of them speaking the same truth in different voices. This moment, just as it is, holds everything you need. Let that knowing settle over you now like snow, soft and complete, as consciousness drifts toward the peace it has always been seeking, the peace it has always been. The stones have been set down, the cup has been emptied, the weeds have shown their value, the present moment has been found, the anger has been released, the woman has been carried and put down, the seeking has ended in discovery, the worry has loosened its grip, everything has been given away, the reflection has been seen through, the crack has let in the light, and the flower has bloomed in silence, teaching nothing, revealing everything. Rest now in this knowing. Rest in the peace that needs no words, no striving, no understanding. Rest in what you have always been, beneath all the seeking, all the worry, all the carrying, all the holding on. Rest in the simple truth that you are already home, have always been home, and the journey you thought you needed to take was only the journey of recognizing what was here all along. Breathe softly, let go completely, and sleep in the deep peace that knows no lack, no separation, no distance between this moment and eternity. The 12 stories have brought you here, to this soft darkness, to this gentle release, to this perfect rest. Peace, complete peace, just this, just now, just breathing, just being, just home.